At the time that this happened, every weekend I drove roughly 2 hours north for some rehearsals. The routine, it was pretty consistent. Leave the city mid-afternoon, practice late into the night in a rented industrial shed, then drive back alone after midnight. We typically finished between 1:30 and 3 in the morning. After packing equipment, I would take a series of minor rural roads instead of the main highway to avoid police checkpoints and reduce traffic delays. The route was pretty quiet, poorly lit, and ran through a long stretch of farmland. Now, one night in late winter, around 2011, I left rehearsal at about 2:15 in the morning. The conditions were pretty clear, there was no rain or wind or anything, and I had driven less than about 10 minutes from the warehouse when I noticed a person walking along the shoulder of a narrow rural road. This immediately stood out because there were no houses nearby and no public transport operating at that hour. As I approached, I saw it was a young woman wearing what appeared to be a formal dress. The clothing was really out of place for the temperature, which was near freezing at this point. She turned toward my vehicle and signaled for me to stop. I pulled over because the situation, it suggested somebody stranded rather than suspicious, and she approached the rear passenger side rather than the front. Her demeanor was unusually calm and upbeat given the circumstances. She asked if I could give her a ride to a gathering that she claimed was not far away. Her speech was coherent and there were no signs of intoxication or anything. I asked several direct questions, like where she came from, how far she needed to go, and whether anyone else was expecting her. Her answers were vague though, but delivered confidently, and so in the end she entered the back seat without hesitation. I remember asking, or sort of half joking, whether she was setting me up for a robbery, since the situation fit a known rural scam pattern here, and she laughed and denied it. After a few minutes of driving, she instructed me to take a left turn off my normal route. The road she indicated was unsealed and unlit. I questioned the direction several times because it led away from any visible residential areas, but each time she reassured me that we were heading in the correct direction and that a large gathering was taking place beyond a railway crossing. The environment changed quickly. Within a mile or so, there were no visible structures, no lights, and no traffic. My headlights illuminated only open paddocks and fencing now. There were no parked cars, which was inconsistent with the claim of a nearby party as well. She then asked me to stop near a set of disused rail tracks. The location was an isolated intersection with no buildings within visible range, and she exited the vehicle, leaned toward my open window, repeating that I should come and join the event if I wanted. She then walked away from the vehicle toward the darkness, beyond the reach of my headlights. I obviously found this behavior really weird, and after she moved about maybe 10 or 15 meters away, I reversed slightly and turned the car to aim my headlights toward her path. At that point, she was no longer visible, and there were no obstacles that she could have moved behind, and the terrain was completely flat. The area, it consisted only of low grassland and some fencing. There were no sounds of movement, footsteps, or vehicle doors or anything. Assuming a potential threat, I locked my doors and retrieved my firearm from my glove compartment. I remained stationary for about a minute, scanning the area with my high beams, but there was no sign of any other person. I then sort of drove forward slowly, making a loop around the nearby roads while keeping my headlights on full. The search lasted maybe several minutes, but I found no trace of anyone walking, hiding, or entering a vehicle or anything. After confirming the area was empty, I left immediately and returned to the main highway, feeling a chill go down my spine. In the following days, I reviewed maps and satellite imagery of the location, and I confirmed that there were no houses, event venues, or known gathering sites within at least several miles of where she exited. I also checked local reports for missing persons or incidents matching her description, but I never found any. Over time, I developed a bit of a practical explanation, I guess. The most likely scenario is that she was attempting to lure a driver into a vulnerable position, possibly as a part of a robbery setup or whatever, and the sudden disappearance could be explained by her moving quickly beyond the headlight beams into the darkness, combined with my limited depth perception at night. However, what remains difficult to really reconcile for me is the speed at which she vanished in an open, flat environment like that, with no real immediate cover or trees or anything. I have driven rural roads for many years since then, including that same route, and I have never encountered anything like that again. The incident didn't change my belief systems or anything, but it certainly altered how I see isolated roadside encounters at night. Now, when driving in remote areas after dark, I really am hesitant to stop for any individual, unless emergency services are already involved or there's clear evidence of a vehicle breakdown or something. And that decision, it comes directly from that night because, regardless of what happened, the situation, it felt all kinds of wrong. So this happened when I was around 12 years old, and it's one of those things that my family still kind of argues about to this day. So we used to visit my stepdad's hometown every couple of years during school holidays. The location was pretty rural, hours away from my proper city. Population was pretty tiny there, like a few hundred people max, and everybody knew each other, or at least they thought that they did. There was basically one main street, one fuel station, one tiny grocery shop, and then just farmland everywhere. But when we went there, we usually stayed with one of my stepdad's old friends. Their house sat straight on the edge of town, so once you walked past the yard, it was pretty much just dirt roads and paddocks for miles. And one afternoon, not long after we arrived, my mum told me to take their dog out for a walk and gave me a few dollars to grab a drink from a gas station down the road. I was actually pretty excited by this because I like being trusted to walk around on my own, and it felt safe there as well. I mean, nothing ever really happened in that town. So I walked down to the shop, bought a can of lemonade, I think, and sat on the curb outside for a bit while the dog sniffed around. Everything was normal as well until this old white sedan pulled up into the parking area. At first I didn't think too much of it. Cars came and went all the time here. But then the driver didn't get out. Instead, the window rolled down and this older woman leaned across the seat, looking straight at me. She smiled in this weird sort of forced way. Not friendly, more like trying too hard, I guess. She asked me my name. I hesitated, but answered because at that age I didn't really know how to ignore adults, and she just sort of started asking random questions. Where I lived, who I was staying with, how long I'd been in town for. That's when I started getting uncomfortable because small talk in a place like that usually starts with, whose kid are you? Not a bunch of personal questions. Then, she suddenly said that she had a box of old toys in the back of her car and asked if I wanted to see them. That was the first moment that something properly clicked in my head that this was not normal. I said no and stood up, planning to leave. She didn't react like a normal person would, though. Instead of shrugging it off, she got really pushy. She kept insisting that I come and look because they might be worth some money, and said that I could keep whatever I wanted. I told her again that I needed to go back, and her tone changed immediately. She stopped smiling and got really irritated. Then she said that she could drive me back instead, and the way that she said it wasn't like an offer. It sounded more like she'd already decided what was going to happen. That's when I just turned and walked away quickly with my dog. I didn't run yet because I didn't want to show panic, but my stomach was already in knots if I'm being honest. I figured that she would just drive off once she realized that I wasn't interested. But after a minute or two of walking, I heard a car engine creeping behind me. I turned slightly and I saw the same sedan rolling slowly along the dirt road, keeping pace with me. Not passing, but just staying behind. At that point, I started to get proper scared. I didn't want to lead her back to the house where we were staying because for some reason in my brain thought that that might make things worse or something in the long run. So instead of turning toward the house, I took a different track that led toward the local campground area near this river. In hindsight, that was a really bad decision. The campground was mostly empty that day. No staff, no office, just a few scattered caravans far apart. As I walked, the car kept following at a distance. Not close enough to block me, but certainly close enough to make it obvious that she wasn't just driving somewhere. Eventually, I saw a guy unloading some gear from a pickup truck near one of the sites, and I ran straight toward him and started telling him someone was following me. He listened for a few seconds, then looked past me toward the road, and by then, the car had stopped further back. He didn't seem to take it seriously. He just said something like, probably just someone lost, and told me to head home. That honestly made it worse though, because I suddenly felt completely on my own. I looked back again and saw the car start moving slowly toward the campground road. That was when I panicked properly. I picked up the dog and cut through some thick scrub off the sidetrack, basically pushing into some bushes until I was hidden from view. And I stayed there crouched down, barely moving, watching through the gaps in the leaves. Within a minute, the car drove past slowly. Then a few minutes later, it came back again, and again, each time slower, like the driver was scanning the area. After maybe the fourth pass, the car stopped further down the road and the woman actually got out. She started walking along the edge of the track looking around, and that was the moment that I was genuinely convinced that she was searching for me. I stayed completely still for what felt like forever, but eventually she got back into the car, slammed the door, and drove off quickly. I still didn't leave right away though. I waited for probably another half an hour before I felt safe enough to move, and then I ran all the way back to the house, and when I got there, I was shaking and out of breath. At first, my mother thought that I was exaggerating because nothing like that ever happens here, but my stepdad's friend took it seriously, and he asked me to describe the car and the woman in detail. Later that evening, he told my parents that he didn't recognize either of them and that in a place this small that this was really unusual and they should take it seriously. He also said that there had been a few reports over the years of strangers passing through trying to approach kids near the river camping area. After that, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere alone for the rest of the trip, and we never found out who she was. Honestly though, the creepiest part to me isn't the following itself, it's just how calm and patient that she was the whole time, like she fully expected that I'd eventually slip up and that she would catch me. That part, it still sits with me all these years later. So I grew up in a really rural area. Not like small town rural, I mean actual sort of middle of nowhere type place. Houses were spread out here, with long dirt roads, thick bush everywhere, and you couldn't see your nearest neighbor unless you drove to them. Because of that, our school used one of those sort of small minibuses instead of a normal big bus, and it would just drop us kids off one by one along these long roads. My stop was always the last one on the route, so every afternoon it was just me getting off alone while the bus drove back away toward town. Where I got dropped off wasn't even near my house too. It was just a cluster of mailboxes at the start of a narrow gravel road that led into the forest there. From there, I would walk about 10 minutes to reach our property. Most days, nothing happened too. I would just walk home, sometimes kick some rocks or just mess around with some sticks like kids do. But one afternoon, something felt off almost immediately when I got off the bus. When the bus pulled up, I noticed a guy standing near the mailboxes. That alone was really weird because I knew basically everyone who lived on that road, at least by sight, and when someone new moved in, it was usually a pretty big topic among the parents there. This guy, though, wasn't somebody that I'd ever seen before. He wasn't doing anything obvious, just sort of standing there messing with one of the mailbox doors, like he couldn't get it closed properly. I didn't think too much of it at first. Kids don't really realize stuff like that, I guess, but I just got off the bus like I normally did. As soon as the bus drove away, I started walking down the gravel road toward my house. After maybe 30 seconds, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned slightly and saw that same guy had started walking down the road too. Again, I didn't panic immediately. It was a public road after all, but it certainly felt strange because nobody ever just sort of walked down there unless they lived on one of the properties. He wasn't talking to me at first. He was just sort of muttering under his breath, and I couldn't make out any words, just low mumbling. I remember pulling out my little handheld game console from my backpack because that's what I usually did on the walk home. That's when he suddenly spoke clearly. He asked where I was playing. Not in a friendly way, but more like flat and repetitive, like somebody asking a question without really caring about the answer, I guess. I didn't respond right away. I just kept walking. Then he asked again, same exact tone, and then again. It started feeling really uncomfortable because he kept saying it over and over like he was stuck on a loop. Eventually, I turned around because I thought maybe if I just answered that he would finally stop. And the moment that I looked at his face is when I realized that something was seriously wrong. He wasn't smiling or angry or anything normal. He just had this really intense stare, like he wasn't even focusing on me specifically, just sort of staring through me. He was also scratching his neck constantly, like hard, quick movements, and his head kept twitching side to side. That's when I actually got scared, and I didn't scream or run right away. I just started crying quietly while still walking forward because I didn't know what else to do. After maybe 10 to 15 seconds of that, he suddenly sped up and walked past me really quickly without saying anything. That actually made it worse because I didn't know what he was going to do next. He suddenly went off to the side of the road and into the forest there and disappeared from sight. I thought that maybe that was it at the time, but then maybe 5 seconds later, I heard him again, deeper in the trees somewhere parallel to the road. He started making these loud noises that sounded a bit like laughing at first, but not normal laughing. It would cut off suddenly and then turn into something that sounded more like yelling or gasping and then back into laughing again. It didn't sound like he was moving away either, and it sounded like he was keeping pace with me through the forest line there. That was when I finally ran. I ran the rest of the way home, which was way longer than it sounds when you're a kid, and you think somebody is following you like this. The noises kept going the whole time though, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always somewhere inside of the trees next to the road. I didn't stop running until I got to our house too, and luckily the door wasn't locked because back then we almost never locked it during the day. I went inside, locked everything immediately, and just sat on the floor trying to listen if I could still hear him. After a few minutes, it went completely silent, and my parents didn't get home for another 20 minutes because they both worked in town, and when they did, I told them everything. My dad, he drove back down the road immediately to check, but there was nobody there. No cars anywhere, no footprints that he could see, and nothing unusual at the mailboxes. They did report it to the police, and a couple of officers came by later that evening and asked some questions, but they basically said that it was likely somebody passing through or someone dealing with mental health issues who had wandered in the area, or maybe someone taking drugs or something. And so, in the end, nothing ever really came of it. Nobody else on the road reported seeing him, and I never did see him again after that day. But for years afterward, I refused to walk that road alone any longer. So my parents had rearranged their schedules so someone could pick me up at the mailbox instead of making me walk home. Even now as an adult, if I'm walking somewhere quiet and I hear footsteps behind me that don't match my pace, I instantly think about that afternoon, and sometimes I even get a bit teary. So I worked in residential maintenance between 2016 and 2020 for a subsidized housing complex in the Midwest United States. The building primarily housed elderly tenants and individuals with long-term mental health conditions. And because of that demographic, complaints involving noise, paranoia, or misunderstandings between neighbors were common and usually resolved without any physical findings. One tenant in particular filed maintenance reports stating that somebody was striking the shared wall of his unit late at night. He was specific about the timing too, usually between 1 and 3 in the morning, and claimed that the impacts were deliberate and rhythmic rather than just random noise. The adjacent unit, it belonged to an older woman who consistently denied making any noise. We inspected both units multiple times and found no structural issues, like loose pipes or mechanical sources that could produce that type of sound. And since there was no objective evidence, and because the complainant had a documented psychiatric history, the issue remained pretty much unresolved. Several months later, the woman in the adjacent unit relocated to assisted living. After her departure, the apartment became my responsibility to prepare for turnover. That process involved removing personal items left behind, conducting minor repairs, and completing some cleaning work before a new tenant could move in. During the first few days of entry, there were no irregular findings. The unit showed typical signs of long-term occupancy, like worn flooring, dust accumulation, and outdated fixtures and whatnot. But there was nothing that indicated structural instability, pest infestations, or anything else that might explain the earlier noise complaints. On the final day of work in that unit, I noticed an immediate physical reaction upon entering, which was weird. It wasn't related to the temperature because the thermostat reading was consistent with the rest of the building. The sensation was more consistent with heightened alertness, I guess, similar to how someone might respond to an experience in a confined or unfamiliar environment. At the time, I attributed it to fatigue because I'd been working extended hours that week and I was pretty tired. And so I continued with routine tasks for several hours. The apartment layout is relevant to what occurred later, so I'll have to explain a little bit here, but the main entrance door opened into a narrow hallway, and there was a visible gap of maybe about 2 centimeters beneath the door. The living room windows faced north toward a converted exterior walkway, which limited direct sunlight penetration, and because of the overhang, the interior lighting conditions remained relatively constant throughout the day. Now, near the end of my shift, I carried my tools out of the apartment and stepped into the corridor. After moving several meters away, I experienced what I can only describe as like an unexplained impulse to look back toward the closed unit door. And when I turned, I observed a distinct shadow visible beneath the door gap. The shape resembled 2 feet, positioned directly on the interior side of the door, consistent with someone standing within 1 meter of it. At that point, the apartment was supposed to be empty. Also, I had been inside continuously for several hours and had personally locked the door when leaving. There were no additional entrances that could be accessed without passing through my line of sight, and as I continue observing, the shadow shifted in a manner consistent with a person walking away from that door. The movement lasted only a few seconds before disappearing completely, and I didn't reopen the door to investigate at that moment. Instead, I left the area and I reported the incident to my supervisor. And so, later that afternoon, I returned with another staff member to examine possible external causes. We considered whether someone could have passed by the window and cast a shadow through an indirect light or something, but due to the orientation of the building and the overhead awning and all that, there was insufficient light angles to project a defined silhouette through the interior and out under the door like that. We also checked whether anyone could have accessed the apartment from a secondary entrance, but the only other opening was a sealed emergency window that has not been disturbed since, well, I don't know when. There was no evidence of forced entry, no internal light sources left active, and no reflective surfaces positioned in a way that could plausibly create that specific shadow pattern. Now, from a practical standpoint, the most likely explanation would have involved some combination of lighting distortion, Maybe a visual misinterpretation and an expectation bias after months of hearing about the prior tenant's complaints. I get all that. But I just cannot get over the clarity and the motion of the silhouette, and that it just didn't align well with typical shadow artifacts, and I just cannot explain it. An additional detail too became relevant later. So the tenant who originally complained about nighttime banging stopped filing reports entirely after that adjacent unit became vacant. He never provided an explanation for why the noises ceased, but given the building's population, it is statistically likely that multiple residents had died in the various units over the years due to age or medical conditions. There was no documented record of any specific incident occurring in that particular apartment, but you could pretty much bet your bottom dollar that somebody had passed away in there at some point. And I guess what has stayed with me all this time is not the visual itself, but it was the timing. Specifically that it happened on the final day of work in that unit, after months of documented complaints about unexplained nighttime disturbances that had never been verified. And it is that little corresponding point that has always made me feel uneasy about what I saw. The property that my father acquired in late 2009 was located in a small regional town in eastern Colorado. It was a two-story commercial structure built in the early 1900s with thick masonry walls and a long history of mixed use. According to county records and prior owners, it had operated at different times as a roadside boarding house, a mechanic workshop at one stage, a cafe, and later a private residence above a retail unit. When my father purchased it, his intention was to run his freight logistics business from the ground floor while using the upper level as family living space. Architecturally, the upstairs was essentially one large open room with a single partition, dividing a bathroom and a narrow kitchen area. The remainder was open floor space that could be configured into sleeping and living zones, but I don't think that they were ever used that way. The layout also included a recessed storage alcove near the bathroom entrance, which would later become relevant. Now, in 2011, my family moved into the renovated upstairs. During the first several years, there were no objectively unusual incidents too. However, my mother did report one episode that she described as a severe sleep paralysis event. Apparently, she woke during the night unable to move, experienced difficulty breathing, and perceived a strong sense of a threat despite no external stimulus. This lasted maybe less than a minute, she said, and it never repeated. At the time, we treated it as a bit of a medical sleep disorder rather than anything environmental or spiritual. In 2015, we relocated to a different house, but my father retained the building for business use. I continued working for him and occasionally used the upstairs area during long shifts. And one afternoon that year, I went upstairs to rest on an old mattress that we had left behind, and I experienced an episode consistent with sleep paralysis, inability to move, full awareness of surroundings, and a sensation of pressure on my limbs. I also perceived what I can only describe as something resembling low voices. The episode ended within seconds, though, and I just attributed it to fatigue combined with sleeping face down, which I never really do. In 2016, a friend temporarily stayed in the upstairs unit. She didn't report specific events, but repeatedly stated that she felt uncomfortable being alone there. She also left after several months due to unrelated personal circumstances. In 2018, a relative moved into the apartment following a marital separation and financial setbacks. He lived there for maybe about 1 year, and during that time he displayed significant emotional instability related to his personal situation. And unfortunately, he ultimately took his own life off-site on a location several miles away. This event, it had a strong psychological impact on our family and permanently altered how we perceived the building. Later that same year, my partner and I moved into the upstairs space due to housing constraints. And within the first few weeks, we sort of heard noises consistent with the building settling or whatever. Because of the age and the construction type, we considered these just routine, I guess. On our first night staying there, both of us experienced vivid dreams, though, involving horrible themes of like death and stuff. While this was unsettling, we recognized it could reasonably be explained by prior knowledge of the building's history and also some recent family trauma. Eventually, we adopted a cat shortly afterward, and the animal consistently reacted to a specific location in that apartment, the recess storage area near the bathroom partition. The behavior included staring at the corner, sudden freezing and retreating to hidden spaces. And while animal behavior can sometimes be interpreted subjectively, the pattern was consistent over months. And eventually, the cat even began using the space behind the kitchen appliances as a bit of a refuge when it seemed really stressed. Now, one morning, my partner reported hearing the cat being really stressed out while she was in the bathroom, unusually so, and when she exited, she initially could not locate the cat and later found out that it was hiding in a sort of inaccessible gap behind the microwave stand. There were no signs of injury, thankfully, but at the same time, I recalled experiencing a repetitive dream involving falling without impact, which may have coincided with the event, but anyway, the ground floor was later leased to a craftsman who specialized in ceremonial clothing for cultural events, and during a casual conversation outdoors one evening, he independently mentioned hearing footsteps from above after observing us leaving the property. He specifically distinguished the sound from animal movement, describing it as heavy, like boots, pacing and consistent with a person walking across a wooden floor. He also described an incident in which he observed rapid movement inside his unit while approaching the building at night, initially assuming a break-in. When he entered, the interior was secured and empty, and he had no motivation to fabricate these claims and had not previously discussed the subject with us, so that was definitely a bit weird. He later proposed performing a traditional smoke purification ritual, which he explained was intended as a cultural practice for psychological and environmental resets rather than a supernatural intervention. And so we ended up agreeing to participate. Afterward, both us and the tenant subjectively reported reduced anxiety and fewer unusual weird events that were taking place, and from a psychological standpoint, this could be interpreted as just stress relief effects rather than a change in external conditions. I know that, but it definitely felt different. Anyway, we moved out about a year later, and the cat no longer exhibited avoidant behaviors in the subsequent homes that we stayed in, which was definitely a bit strange. And in the following years, several other occupants used the upstairs space intermittently, and most of them described it as uncomfortable but didn't report any specific incidents. In 2024, a longtime acquaintance moved into the apartment with his spouse. I hadn't discussed any prior experiences with them, and during a social gathering months later, his spouse mentioned feeling uneasy when alone in the apartment, and noted that their dogs frequently reacted to an unseen thing in this one particular area. Without prompting as well, she identified the same recessed corner near the bathroom as the location where both she and the animals appeared most agitated. Now, there's no verified historical documentation that I could find connecting that specific location to any significant event. The building's documented past, it includes multiple ownership changes and at least one recorded suicide decades earlier, but nothing that is precise or within that very location. And despite all of the explanations that we could come up with, the consistent pattern across unrelated occupants over 15 years, particularly the repeated focus on the same physical location by animals as well, remains difficult for us to just pass by as coincidence. I really don't know what to think about that place or our time there, but something is definitely off about it, and the animals, they seem to react to it the most. Back in 1994, my family moved into an older home in rural Illinois. The house had been built in the early 1900s and had a finished basement with a low ceiling, concrete floor, and several storage rooms. At the time, I didn't know much about the property's history beyond what neighbors had mentioned. Apparently, several people had died there decades earlier, and it had gone through a series of owners before my parents bought it. Now, one afternoon, I was in the basement using a small home gym that my father had installed. My son, Trevor, who was 8 at the time, and his cousin Gabby, who was 9, came down the stairs, and they were loud and energetic, as kids really are, running between the storage rooms, kicking a small soccer ball, and generally just making it difficult for me to concentrate. But I asked them to go back upstairs to give me a bit of space, and they said that they were going to play hide and seek, and I said fine, just don't bother me. And so they ran upstairs, and I resumed my workout. A few minutes later, I heard steps coming back down the stairs, and I assumed it was Gabby, so I turned and I saw a small figure sort of dart past me toward one of the storage room doors. She crouched behind the door and waited there. I didn't think too much of it at first. Then Trevor came down, whispering to me, "Have you seen Gabby?" I sort of gestured directly toward the storage door, indicating that I had seen her hide there. Trevor walked over and pulled on the door, but the room was empty. At that moment, my blood ran cold, and I knew from experience that something was off. I called out for Gabby, and after a few seconds I heard her respond, but it was from the top of the stairs. She had never actually come back down, apparently, and my heart sank as I realized that I had clearly seen her moving in the basement when, logically, she could not have been there. I went upstairs to check, and Gabby confirmed that she had stayed the whole time and had no idea why I would have thought otherwise. Her puzzled expression, it quickly turned to fear once I explained what I had seen. This was not the first strange occurrence in that house too, because family members, including my husband and children, would occasionally report hearing footsteps, voices, or objects moving without explanation. Certain areas, like the basement or a corner of the attic, seemed to generate more reports than others too. Objects left in those locations sometimes ended up in different spots the next day. Some family members mentioned seeing shadows or vague figures, though no one reported witnessing a fully formed apparition in person like I had seen. Over time, we came to understand that the house had several hotspots of unusual activity. Some events were auditory, voices calling names or footsteps pacing across empty rooms, and others were visual, like shadows moving out of the corner of your eye. Occasionally, objects would move or be displaced without explanation too, and the experiences were consistent enough across multiple people that we couldn't easily dismiss them as just imagination. As far as the history went, the previous occupant who died in the home was reportedly a devout woman who practiced Orthodox Judaism or something. Beyond that, details were pretty scarce, and there was no indication of any foul play. The activity, though, seemed to be connected to the environment itself, I would say, rather than from any specific event or person. From a practical standpoint, too, I've always tried to rationalize these experiences. Old houses creak, drafts can shift objects, and children's movements can appear faster or in unexpected places. Sleep deprivation or expectation can amplify perception as well, but the basement incident with Gabby, that was difficult to explain logically. Seeing someone move when they were physically elsewhere, consistently, was beyond normal misperception. After that day too, we limited access to the basement whenever we could. Children were warned to stay upstairs, and adults remained cautious in the areas where we repeatedly noticed disturbances. And while none of these events resulted in any physical harm, the sense of unease and unpredictability was enough to make those locations off-limits for extended periods. We eventually moved out of that house in the late 1990s. None of the family members experienced similar incidences afterward in other places, which really suggests that there was something odd going on in that Illinois home, something that I've never been able to explain. In the summer of 2019, I was traveling for work and decided to stay in a budget hostel in downtown Los Angeles to save some money. The hostel was a 6-bed dorm with 3 bunk beds and shared bathrooms down the hall. I had the bottom bunk on one side of the room, and the top bunk was assigned to another solo traveler, a woman from the UK. I had seen her around the lobby earlier that day, and she seemed like a normal traveler, quiet and pretty reserved. Earlier in the week, I'd been on a road trip from Las Vegas to a small motel near Tonopah, Nevada, known locally for its strange history. I stayed there with a friend, and while we joked about hauntings and attempted a few games involving summoning spirits, nothing seemed dangerous, though there were some genuinely strange noises that night. I personally chalked those up to just the building, though. That night in LA, though, I woke up at around 5:15, stepped outside for a cigarette at some stage, and returned to the room. Everything was quiet and appeared normal, and so I climbed back into my bunk, pulling up my blanket, when I started hearing a low sort of murmuring voice above me. Initially, I thought it was sleep talking, and so I just tried to ignore it. But then I clearly heard her mutter, summoning spirits. I froze. The tone of her voice didn't match normal sleep talking. It was deliberate, almost chanting. My mind immediately went to safety precautions, and she could be unstable, and I had no idea what she was capable of. So I quietly reached for my backpack and purse, planning to leave without alerting her. As I slid off the bunk to move toward the door, I realized that she had already descended halfway down the ladder. Her expression was strange, too. A wide, unnatural grin, and she locked eyes with me. Then she said clearly, "Lily, why are you panicking?" I didn't stop to process. I literally ran out of that room, nearly tripping on the ladder, and went straight to the front desk. The night receptionist came back with me to help me retrieve my belongings, and when we opened the dorm room door, the top bunk was now empty. There was no sound from the room, but something about the shadows in the corners felt a bit off, and then I noticed movement near the small communal kitchen in the hostel's common area. She was there, half hidden in the darkness, watching silently. The moment, though, that she realized that I wasn't alone, she disappeared behind a wall instantly. I grabbed my things as quickly as I possibly could, and I left the building. The receptionist later confirmed that the woman had not been registered for the night, and apparently she had checked out several days prior, but had re-entered the hostel without permission or something. There was no way of knowing how long she had been in the building or what she intended, but I wasn't about to try and find out. I never did stay in that hostel again, and I also avoided shared dorms for solo travel for the rest of that year. And thinking about it now, the situation combined several risk factors, I guess you could say. A stranger with unknown intentions, isolation, and an enclosed space like that. The psychological tension alone was enough to feel threatening, but the physical presence and her behavior made it an objectively unsafe encounter. Apparently, too, the cops were called, but by the time that they got there, she was gone. I've hesitated to tell this story because, well, look, I know how it might sound, but it stuck with me over a decade, and so I thought that I should get it out there. So this happened sometime between 2010 and 2013. I was around 9 or 10 years old. The setting was a suburban park in Portland, Oregon, typical playground, baseball diamond, and a trail leading into a small patch of woods. There was ongoing construction nearby, and a circular concrete water cistern sat off the path, mostly ignored. But I was there with my aunt that day. 2 older women were walking a few yards ahead of us, chatting as they passed the cistern, and everything seemed pretty normal. When we reached that spot, I instinctively glanced to my right, and there was something above the cistern, maybe a foot or so off the ground, and I remember thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me at first. It was roughly humanoid, sitting cross-legged. Its skin was a muted blue with a layered texture, like something shifting beneath the surface. It had 4 arms and narrow yellow eyes that locked onto me immediately. It wore a cloak, or maybe a robe is a better way to say it, gold and blue in color, but the patterns moved subtly, almost imperceptibly. Any time that I tried to focus on a single detail, though, it would shift just enough to throw me off, and the second that our eyes met, everything changed. The sound in the park dulled as if someone had turned the volume down. Birds were still chirping and cars were still passing in the distance, but it all sounded very distant. My ears began ringing and my body felt heavier suddenly, like I was standing in water. I thought that I should take a step back, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were just fused to the ground all of a sudden. Oddly too, I wasn't afraid, and I heard my aunt calling my name, but it sounded muffled, far away even, though she was right beside me. She called again, and this time it was closer, and then in an instant, normal sound returned and my body weight normalized. She grabbed my arm and we walked quickly down the trail. I risked one glance back and the figure was still there, hovering above the cistern. Its posture was calm and neither aggressive nor welcoming, and it simply watched us. Afterward, I didn't speak about it for years because it was so strange, but in 2022, I casually sort of mentioned it to my aunt, and she remembered it too. She said that she had tried to push the memory away because it unnerved her deeply, and I've never experienced anything like it again since then. The combination of the time distortion thing, the muffled sound, and the present itself was unlike anything I've ever encountered in my life. And I'm sharing this now to see if anyone else has had a similar experience out there. All I can say too is that, while I don't know for sure, it certainly felt entirely real, but at the same time, it's almost impossible to explain, and I know that. I've gone back and forth about telling this story because I still could not explain it, and even thinking about it makes my chest tighten a bit. This happened when I was 17, roughly 14 years ago now, and my girlfriend at the time saw it too. I'm not claiming to know what this actually is, but it was completely outside of normal experiences, that much I'm sure of. Whether it was sleep paralysis, drugs, or hallucinations, they don't account for what happened. So we were living in Portsmouth, Virginia, on a second-floor apartment. Across the small street was another building, 3 stories, 20 or so windows, fairly ordinary. And for a few weeks before the main incident, my girlfriend would wake me around 2 or 3 in the morning, insisting that she could see strange figures in that building. I usually ignored her because, well, I'm a pretty heavy sleeper and I just didn't want to deal with it, but one night I was standing by our window with a new glass pipe that I had just bought. I packed it and held it in my hands, and almost instantly, it felt unbearably heavy, as if the gravity had tripled or quadrupled. It slipped and smashed on the hardwood floor, the weeds scattered across the tiles, and I froze, staring at the shards, and I shut the window and went back to bed, but the sensation of wrongness just sort of lingered with me. Well, a few nights later, around 3 in the morning, we were walking back from my brother-in-law's apartment behind ours. My girlfriend tugged at my sleeve and told me to look toward the building across the street. At first glance, it seemed like a late-night party or something. People moving in the windows, disco lights, and some shadows. But that's when I noticed that they were not normal people. They were at least 6 feet, maybe 7, black as pitch and solid but completely featureless. Their torsos were stiff and their arms extended straight at odd angles from where the necks should be. There were no faces, and one figure's body even bent in a sort of rough Z shape. The top of the Z for the head and the arms, and the lower 4 legs at the bottom of the Z. 2 of them seemed physically connected even, and one was sort of bent forward over the other, but their movements were identical to the rest, a sort of rigid side-to-side sway. The disco lights in the room didn't touch them at all, which was really weird. The coloured beams sort of passed around their forms as if the figures absorbed or blocked the light entirely. I whispered to my girlfriend and she confirmed that she saw the same thing. They resembled the crude stick figures a child might draw, but they were fully three-dimensional, solid and moving in unison. And apparently, this is what my girlfriend at the time was trying to get my attention for. She had seen them before. Above them, a man was pacing in a separate window, bathed in dim yellow light, scrolling on his phone. Another window showed a figure reading under the same faint light, and these people looked normal, but they didn't interact with the dancers at all. And then it happened. The weight of attention. Even though none of the figures turned toward us, we both suddenly felt it. A collective awareness, like standing before a crowd of strangers and feeling them sort of scrutinize every movement. The pressure in our chests was immediate. A physical sensation of just dread suddenly came over both of us. My own stomach, it tightened, my heart began racing, and we just bolted back inside. 10 or 15 seconds later, we were behind the locked door of our apartment, asking what the hell we had just seen. When we looked back out the window, everything was now gone. The dancers had vanished, the colored lights still flashed, the yellow lights still glowed, but there was no movement, no black figures, nothing to explain the prior sighting. We stayed in that apartment another month, and nothing similar happened again, and my girlfriend never saw anything. I've spent years trying to rationalize it, and look, I get it. It sounds really weird. The closest theory that I've come up with is that there was some sort of shadow or two-dimensional projection or something. Perhaps the normal-looking people had set some sort of thing up or whatever. I have no idea why they would do that, but heck, people do weird things. But even now, more than a decade later, I can still feel the pressure in my chest if I think about it. I really don't have a logical explanation, and I don't know if anyone else has seen anything like this, but if you have, then I would really like to know. My great-aunt lived alone for nearly 3 decades in her townhouse in Cleveland, Ohio. She was highly independent and rarely socialized, but she spent hours each day praying and performing small rituals that she believed kept the house safe. When my mother was 15, a visiting priest came to bless the house. He immediately reported a strong sense of interference, and he said that he could not complete the prayers because something in the house disrupted his focus. He described the feelings as a persistent weight pressing against his concentration, though he never did specify if he thought it was spiritual or just psychological. Years later, though, my great-aunt continued to live alone. She hired construction workers to repair a section of the backyard patio at some stage, and they slept in tents near the trees during the nights, and after the first evening, they told her that they had heard a woman crying loudly in the yard and claimed that they saw a figure with long dark hair standing silently near the old oak tree. The workers left the site and they refused to return, citing fear for their safety. In the last 2 years of her life, my mother cared for my great-aunt during a serious illness. Despite her care, my great-aunt still spoke negatively about my mother to neighbors and family. She passed away at our home after finally expressing that she wanted to experience things that she had missed earlier in life. My mother handled the funeral and the last rites too. Now, the night of the funeral, my mother went to bed and immediately felt something unusual. She reported a sort of tapping sensation on her shoulder, like fingernails hitting her skin. Within seconds, she felt intense pressure on her chest and upper body, as if something heavy was sitting on her. She described an overwhelming sense of impending danger, and her limbs felt really sluggish. She struggled to climb the stairs later that night and had to use her hands to pull herself up, but She requested my father to schedule a medical appointment immediately, fearing that her condition was beyond ordinary fatigue or even grief. On the way to the clinic, though, they passed St. Jude's Church where a feast was being held. My mother decided to enter, and during the blessing, the priest placed 2 candles crossed over her neck, a traditional ritual meant to transfer protection and relief. And the moment that the blessing was complete, my mother reported that the pressure and the pain just vanished completely. She was physically and mentally shocked as well by the speed and the intensity of the change. Before this incident, my mother had confided in a friend who had experienced similar situations in her own family. That friend explained that intense spiritual interferences can sometimes lead to life-threatening conditions within a month if left unchecked. 2 days later, we sent a staff member to check on my great-aunt's townhouse. She called in a panic, though, because a large tree in the backyard had fallen overnight, roots lifted completely from the soil. But there had been no storm, wind, or any natural cause that could have caused it. In fact, the day and the night had been sunny and calm. When the staff member returned yesterday, though, she reported feeling the same pressure and unease that my mother had experienced immediately after the funeral. Her symptoms mirrored my mother's almost exactly, and at this point, my mother was convinced that my great-aunt's continuous prayers and rituals were containing whatever presence or force was in that house. And now, with her gone, the situation appears to be escalating, affecting anyone who even enters the property. I don't have a rational explanation for any of this, and the combination of unexplained physical symptoms, objects moving, and the prior reports of figures and cries, it really suggests that something beyond normal environmental or psychological causes is happening in this place. And now, with anyone who goes there feeling weird and sick or whatever, I'm wondering if anyone out there has any idea as to what we could do about this. We probably need to sell the place at some stage, and so getting rid of whatever this is, well, it seems pretty important to do that first. This involves 2 events from my time at my first assignment as a firefighter. I combine them here because they both occurred in the same building and contributed to the sense of unease that I had while stationed there. So in 2011, fresh out of the fire academy, I was assigned to this particular station. The building was constructed in 1928, 2 stories tall with 2 separate bays, one for engines and one for the battalion chief. Stations like this, they carry a lot of history. I often thought about all the firefighters who had worked there over the decades, and one of the interesting features was the old pole from the 2nd floor to the engine bay. It was functional, but because there was only a single flight of stairs, nobody ever really used it. It was mostly a relic, though it always drew attention during the public hours. Now, my bunk was on the 2nd floor, located right next to the pole hole. It was also the closest bed to the door leading to the stairs. The station's doors were all original wood with no metal or automatic locks. The practice was to keep the bedrooms as dark and as cold as possible so that firefighters could rest between calls. When a call came in, the house lights flashed on with a loud pop, a siren would sound, and dispatch would relay the call details. From the beginning, I noticed something unusual about the place, though. The door leading to the stairs would often open on its own seconds before the house lights would come on, signaling a call. Nobody could explain it. There were no locks or automatic mechanisms. The veterans always joked that it was a retired firefighter checking in on the new guys, and I accepted it as a part of the station's quirks in the end. But the first incident that really unsettled me occurred about 2 weeks into my assignment. So I was asleep in the bunk next to the pole hole. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up suddenly and I saw a figure at the foot of my bed. It was wearing the standard quick hitch pants firefighters keep ready in case of a call, and bunker pants folded neatly beside the bed. At first, I assumed it was one of the senior firefighters, maybe Captain Roth, doing a late-night check. But when I focused above the pants, the rest of the figure was missing. The torso and the head were completely absent, as if the pants were standing on their own. The image vanished entirely after a few seconds, but I was completely startled. I told myself at the time that it must just be fatigue or my brain playing tricks on me, but the experience left me feeling very uneasy. After that, I moved my bunk to the far corner of the room so that I could sleep facing a solid wall too. Now, the second event happened a few months later, under similar circumstances. I was again sleeping near the pole hole when a loud noise woke me, and at first it sounded like somebody dropping equipment, but the station was silent. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the stairs door. The door swung open slowly, but nobody entered. But then, I saw the faint outline of a person moving toward the pole. It had the appearance of a firefighter walking in the dark, but no facial features were visible, only the shape of shoulders, arms, and the helmet head slightly tilted. Instantly, I felt my heart racing, but the figure did not advance past the hallway. Within seconds, it simply disappeared as if it had never been there. After these incidents, I started noticing patterns too. The apparitions always appeared near the pole hole or at the door of the stairs, and they never interacted with anyone, never spoke, and always vanished before they could fully be observed. I asked other recruits if they had seen anything, and some shrugged it off as just, people being tired and seeing things or whatnot. But a few older firefighters confirmed that they had seen similar phenomena when they were rookies, and the consensus was that they were likely spirits of retired firefighters still patrolling the station. And while nothing really ever happened to me, I guess, the sense of being watched and the visual partial figures was enough to make me change my sleeping arrangements, and I also began double-checking all the equipment and ensuring that I was never alone in the bunk area during night shifts. Eventually, I transferred to another station, and I later learned that several other new hires at Station 14 had similar encounters, seeing shadows or partial figures near the pole, hearing unexplained noises, or noticing the door to the stairs moving without cause as well. Like I said, the events were never really dangerous or anything, but the consistency across different shifts and years as well suggested that this was more than just simple imagination, as some of the other guys used to say. To this day, I do consider those experiences real enough to warrant caution, especially in older firehouses with long histories like this. The partial figures, the timing near the pole, and the sudden disappearances all contributed to the uneasy feeling that someone, or perhaps something, was monitoring us. In 2003, when I was 9 years old, my mother and stepfather rented a house in Illinois, in a suburban neighborhood where most houses were built using the same design and materials. The house we moved into, it had a large addition at the back, a living room that was significantly bigger than the garage, larger than any other space in the home, in fact. The first impression was that it was unusually dark, even during the day. As a child, I was pretty sensitive to unusual atmospheres, I guess you could say, and that darkness created a distinct feeling of unease from the first week. On our first night, we received a package at the door too. It contained a book with no return address, no sender name, and just our address. Opening it revealed the little witchcraft and summoning practices book. My sister and I were immediately unsettled by this. We were raised Christian, you see, and my stepfather was still questioning his beliefs at the time. My mother, visibly alarmed, tore the book apart and threw it away in a dumpster a short distance from the house, and that really should have been the end of it, but unfortunately it wasn't. Within a few months, my mother and older sister began reporting shadowy figures moving along the hallways. I rarely saw them, but the house itself amplified a feeling of tension. The family was going through a period of frequent arguments and isolation, which only seemed to intensify this presence. The first concrete incident that I remember involved the bathroom near my bedroom. I was using it while listening to music on my iPod one day when I heard scratching at the door. Assuming that my sister was playing a prank or something, I yelled out to her to stop. The scratching continued briefly, sounding like a long fingernail tracing the surface, and when I finished and spoke to my sister, she insisted that she hadn't left the living room at the time. I realized then that whatever was making that sound had been just outside of the door, and it was unseen, and it wasn't anybody in the home. Later, my Uncle Marco came from Chicago to visit at some stage. He chose to sleep in the living room floor while my sister and I took the couch, and one night I awoke with a heavy feeling of being watched. I noticed the stove light in the kitchen was on. It had been left on for nighttime navigation, and standing by the kitchen island was a small figure, roughly the size of a child, wearing a white dress with long hair covering its face. There was no facial features, and I froze, unable to wake anyone. After a few seconds, the figure just disappeared when I blinked, and that was the only time that I saw it. Over the years, I also had reoccurring dreams connected to the house. In these dreams, I confronted large, shadowy figures. One appeared entirely blue, wearing a form-fitting suit-like layer. Its eyes were yellow, teeth sharp, and hands elongated. And during these dreams, the surroundings always shifted to red lighting, heightening the sense of threat, I guess, but the dreams felt like the entities were testing or maybe probing me, never physically attacking, but creating extreme fear. Even after moving out, the house seemed to maintain a connection with us too, because shortly after we left, another unsolicited package arrived, another book on spells. It was clear that someone or something was observing us, and later, neighbors provided some context, because years before, a couple had lived there apparently, and the boyfriend was abusive, and the girlfriend reportedly practiced occult activities in the home. After that couple, tenants never really lasted more than a year there, and that suggested that the house's environment might have persisted, affecting subsequent residents. The house remained in my memory, and not for every day of my life, but as a reoccurring symbol in my dreams, I guess. The house, it certainly left a psychological imprint on me. The shadows, scratching noises, and that single apparition in the kitchen were all consistent markers that something in that space, it didn't conform to, well, the physical world, I guess you could say. I have shared these experiences with my mother, sister, and husband, and recounting them now feels like a bit of an analytical exercise, evaluating patterns, timelines, and triggers, rather than storytelling, I guess. But even after 18 years, the house, it continues to emerge in my dreams from time to time. A reminder, I guess, that certain environments can carry things long after you're gone. A friend of mine one day was hosting a small gathering, and most of the people there were drinking lightly, but I hadn't touched anything personally. But partway through the evening, one of my friend's behaviors became extremely unusual though. Her boyfriend pulled me aside and asked if I could help because I was sober and seemed level-headed. At the time, I found it odd. I mean, usually I was the first guy to get tipsy, but I agreed to check on her anyway. Now, when I entered the room, she was lying on the floor and speaking rapidly in a language that I was unfamiliar with. Her family was Iranian, but the words that she was saying didn't resemble Farsi or English or anything. She was giggling and muttering in an almost mechanical rhythm as well, completely different from her usual personality. I initially assumed that she was joking or just trying to mess with us or something. So I said something absurd, hoping to snap her out of it. Normally, mentioning her hair would get her attention, but this time she didn't react. She abruptly ran out of the room and into the garage where the drinks were set up. The room was familiar. I'd been there multiple times that night. When we followed her, we were pretty stunned. She was standing and staring directly at a mounted deer skull, but the skull had sort of changed. Its surface was now completely black, and the eye sockets had sort of twisting black and white patterns in it, almost like they were moving. The effect was unnatural, and it gave off a subtle sort of oppressive energy, and when she looked at it, she laughed in a way that wasn't her usual voice. We pursued her, but the room's atmosphere shifted in a way that is really hard to describe. The air suddenly felt heavier, and there was a distant sense of wrongness, like the space itself was resisting us. We decided to pray together since we all had some religious background from school, and at first nothing changed. She continued behaving oddly and with mild aggression now. Then one of our friends, who was openly devout, prayed aloud for guidance, and almost immediately the behavior ceased and she just sort of seemed normal again. Afterwards, when I checked the garage, the skull was now back to normal, white in appearance, mounted as it had been originally. No explanation really made sense to me, though. Later, I learned that the family had a history of sleep paralysis, apparently, and that the house had been blessed by church officials multiple times, but nothing what they had said really explained what I had seen. Well, years passed, and I tried to convince myself that it was a trick of the light, or maybe a prank, or a misremembered detail or something. But then I reconnected with the same girl at some stage, and while talking she casually mentioned that she remembered the skull being black with swirling black and white eyes. And instantly I froze, because she described exactly what I had seen that night, even though I never really spoke about it in detail to anyone before. After some research, I learned that the land where the house had sat had a documented history of being considered cursed by local elders, apparently. Whether this was connected to the events I saw, I don't really know, but it made the incident even more difficult to rationalize and certainly more creepier. And so, to this day, I'm really just left questioning what actually happened. Quite honestly, too, if it wasn't for the girl sort of verifying independently what I recalled happening, I probably would have just kept going in life, thinking that it was all just a trick of the eyes or something. But even now, thinking back about that night, it makes me feel uneasy. The combination of her behavior, that skull, and the atmosphere at the time, it's something that I wish I never experienced. I moved into the apartment with my partner in late 2022. It was a small single-level unit in an older complex, and for the first few months, nothing really unusual happened. Our routine was pretty predictable. He worked long hours and I stayed home with our newborn, and because the baby woke during the night, I slept in the second bedroom so that he could rest for work. That meant that I spent most of my time alone in a quiet environment. The layout of the unit made sound travel easily as well, and from the back bedroom I could hear someone stepping into the front patio or opening cabinets in the kitchen. There wasn't much insulation between the rooms, and because of that I used to recognize ordinary household noises. Now, about 3 months after moving in, I began noticing sounds that didn't match any normal activity. It started as what I interpreted as just movement, footsteps or shifting weight on the floor. At first, I assumed it was the building settling or maybe the neighbors or something, but the timing was very inconsistent. Sometimes it happened during the day when the complex was dead quiet. Other times it happened late at night when everything was silent. I also occasionally thought that I saw someone entering the room from the hallway. These were brief peripheral impressions, like catching a shape moving just outside of direct vision. Each time I looked straight at the doorway, though, there was nothing ever there. I initially dismissed this as me being just tired from caring for an infant, even though by that stage the baby was sleeping relatively well at night. But one night, I was awake in bed and heard a sort of short sound that I really couldn't identify. It wasn't loud and more like a single syllable spoken at normal volume, somewhere inside of the unit. Immediately afterward, I thought that I saw my partner step into the doorway, and when I focused on the entrance, the hallway was empty. And then, a few minutes later, he actually did walk in. I asked if he had heard something too, and he said yes and described it clearly. He believed that he had heard a male voice say a simple greeting. He told me that he initially thought that someone had entered the apartment, and that's why he came to check on us, because he was concerned about security. He tried to explain it away as possibly one of the cats making an unusual sound, but he later admitted that it sounded distinctly like a human voice. After that conversation, I told him about the sounds and the visual impressions that I had been noticing too. He didn't appear alarmed and said that it probably was just being stressed from the newborn. He also mentioned that the apartment complex was old and could produce unusual acoustics. Well, several days later, during the afternoon, I was alone in the kitchen preparing a bottle. The apartment was quiet, and I heard a male voice saying a greeting word clearly from a short distance behind me. It was not muffled or distorted this time, and there was no identifiable source. When I turned around immediately, nobody was present. The doors were locked, and only the baby and the pets were inside, but I know what I heard. After that incident too, I became way more cautious. I began keeping background noises running at night so that small sounds would not stand out. I also paid closer attention to patterns as well. The occurrences, they didn't follow any consistent schedule though, and sometimes weeks would pass with nothing at all happening, and then there would be another isolated event, and it was just completely random. One detail though that made the situation difficult to interpret was that the animals showed no reaction. The cats, for instance, never displayed any alert behavior during these moments. They moved normally through the apartment and didn't fixate on any particular area. Over time, I tried to evaluate practical explanations. I considered everything, really, and the apartment did share thin walls with the adjacent units and whatnot. Sound can travel through vents and structural gaps in really unpredictable ways at times. In one instance, I did later confirm that voices from the neighboring unit could be heard clearly when they spoke near certain walls, but eventually we relocated to a different residence for unrelated reasons. And after moving, the sounds and the visual impressions, they stopped completely. There were never any similar experiences in any new environment ever again after that. Our time there was pretty unsettling, and I certainly would not return there if I had the option. And really, it's the fact that everything stopped immediately after moving that really troubles me the most. So my father remarried when I was around 9 years old, and he moved with his new wife into an old house on the outskirts of town. The property was large, built in the 1920s, with a wide yard that wrapped around all sides. Inside, it had a master bedroom, a shared room for my younger brother and me, and a central living area that doubled as a dining and TV space. There was a small attic accessible through a hatch near the back patio, and while I had been shown it once, I never really returned. Now, we spent only part of the week there, since custody was split between our parents, and from the first nights, I noticed an uneasy feeling within the living area. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was a sense of just being watched, I guess, a constant awareness that I just couldn't shake, and I initially attributed it to the size of the house, and my rational mind tried to normalize the sensations. A few days after moving in, the house woke us abruptly though. A loud crash came from the attic, a whole dresser tipping over. My father came running in his shorts, carrying a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other. He was ready for an intruder. My brother and I were instructed to stay in our room while he investigated. When he returned, though, he was completely pale. No one had entered, and the dresser's fall remained completely unexplained. We all tried to rationalize it, like settling vibrations, or maybe the house just was moving or something, but really nothing that we came up with sort of explained it well. Footsteps, too, became a reoccurring issue here. Heavy measured footsteps from the attic echoed down the halls often. The sound was inconsistent with normal household activity as well. Bathroom doors slammed violently when I used them, sometimes narrowly missing me even. Others tried to attribute this to drafts or maybe misaligned doors, but I'm telling you, this was not that. Nightmares began around the same time, and I dreamt of a humanoid figure with wings and a bird-like head in a barren desert-like environment. I know, weird, right? But its wings flapped aggressively, constricting my chest and making it impossible to breathe. I always woke choking, but dismissed it as a bad dream fueled by anxiety. And one evening, while showering, I noticed movement in the patio beyond the bathroom window. I ignored it initially, but the temperature dropped sharply all of a sudden, and I just felt an overwhelming sense of, danger. So I grabbed a towel and I instantly left the room. And that's when I heard the bathroom door slam behind me, as the doors often did in this place, but something about that moment, I just felt like I was in danger. Another night, while I was getting a late snack, I distinctly felt a hand on my shoulder. The sensation was so real, too, that it left me completely frozen. I'll never forget that as long as I live. As the months passed, I spent less and less time in that house. Family tensions and the general chaos of my father's remarriage overlapped with the house's presence, making it hard to isolate cause and effect, but looking back, the home itself seemed to amplify stress and fear for sure. Years later, while staying in a hotel across the country with my father's family, the topic sort of resurfaced at some stage, and his wife recounted an experience of her own. Late one night at the old house, she felt someone brush her hair apparently. She was expecting it to be my father, but when she turned, nobody was there. My father was asleep in another room apparently. At the time, she dismissed it as just her imagination, but she remembers it clearly. That old house, it's since been demolished for a new apartment complex, and knowing that, I can only hope that whatever remained there has dissipated or moved on. Even decades later, I remain aware of bad energy in spaces, and I'm pretty cautious of environments that evoke the same sensations now. Those years in that house, they taught me that perception and environment are deeply intertwined, and that some experiences, while terrifying, can be understood as a combination of stress, isolation, and physical surroundings, and others, they just cannot. Looking back after more than 20 years now, I think it is, I can separate rational explanation from the memory of fear, though the physical sensations and the auditory phenomena, they remain clear in my mind, and also completely unexplainable. I don't claim to have any supernatural abilities or anything, but I do recognize that some spaces can affect our perception in ways that feel, well, beyond logic, I guess you could say. When the time is right, I might share some more of the unusual experiences that I had in that house, particularly the ones that challenged my understanding of what is possible in the natural world. I want to start this by saying that I don't expect anyone to believe this. I mean, if I were hearing this from an outside perspective, I would also dismiss it as just stress or paranoia or something. That said, the patterns that I've experienced over years make it very hard to do that myself. I've also kept the details factual and straightforward here because exaggeration doesn't change the reality of what happened. So, around 2018, when I was about 15 years old, my maternal grandmother passed away in December. I was in her house at the time a few days before her death, and she asked me to stay with her, and I was the last person to speak to her and hold her hand. At the time, it was confusing and stressful since my mother and uncle were supposed to be helping. I went to the funeral and said my goodbyes, though I didn't understand then what would follow. So about a year later, my mother and my younger brother and I purchased a home in a rural location. I disliked the property immediately because it had sort of the same layout and small corridors as my childhood home, where I had earlier experiences of what I now recognize as paranormal events. first, it was minor too, a persistent sensation of just being watched in my bedroom, my pets avoiding certain rooms after dark, and waking abruptly without explanation. Occasionally, I would hear my name being called while alone in the house, but I chalked that up to just me hearing things. I also attributed the other stuff to just stress, like school, college prep, and my own overactive imagination. I also thought that my interest in horror novels and movies may have exacerbated the whole situation a little bit. But the next events, well, they could not be explained away so easily. So, the occurrences escalated. Objects would move without cause, books shifted in shelves, doors creaked open, small items fell from tables, shadows appeared at the edges of my vision, always retreating when I turned to look. I became increasingly reluctant to sleep in my own room, eventually moving my mattresses to my mother's room for the sake of safety. Aunt Carmen, visiting from Cleveland, suggested that we take photographs around the house. In several of these, small white orbs were visible in the corners of the rooms. One photo taken of me sitting on the living room couch captured something more specific though. In the reflection of the back window, there was a distinct face behind me. The features, they resembled my grandmother, soft and familiar, but I couldn't ignore the subtle distortion too. Everyone who saw the photo agreed that it looked like her, though my own intuition felt different. By late 2022, this presence intensified. The sensation of being watched became just constant. Nightmares started reoccurring with disturbing clarity, scenarios where I could see myself injured or trapped, sometimes being pursued or attacked by something. The activity extended beyond my home at work as well. I would catch glimpses of movement at the edge of the stockroom, and items that I had organized were often displaced again. Concerned, I asked Aunt Carmen to perform a pendulum reading. The result was unsettling, and the entity was not my grandmother. According to the reading, it had followed me from the previous house in Ohio, had an intent to be noticed, and reacted when ignored, moving objects and creating sounds. It was attentive and very persistent. I attempted simple protective measures after that. I carried a stone recommended by Aunt Carmen, attempted prayers, and maintained strict routines. But despite this, I still experienced episodes of crushing pressure in the chest and nausea as well, particularly at night or when the entity's presence felt strongest. The most recent incident? Well, that occurred at work. While stocking shelves, I noticed movement from the corner of my vision. Turning, I saw nothing directly, but the air suddenly felt colder and the sense of being watched was immediate. That was when I noticed too that objects nearby were slightly shifted from where I knew that I had left them. This reinforced the pattern that I've observed over the last several years. This thing seems to watch me, it tests boundaries, and it's incredibly persistent. Sometimes too, I'll admit that I cannot determine if I'm imagining some things or if it's real or not. Based on patterns and repeated occurrences, I certainly believe that it's real, and I continue to monitor interactions, avoid unnecessary contact, and take precautions where I can. At this point, I share all this not to elicit belief, but to just document the behavior and establish a record, I guess. Whether this thing is harmful or not, I guess remains to be seen, but my approach for now is to maintain vigilance, avoid isolation when possible, and ensure others are aware of the unusual activity where I can and where people believe me. I will continue to track it, and I will see if its behavior changes, but I know one fact. It has not left me in all these years, and it certainly does not act randomly. This took place in late October 1982 in northern Vermont. My cousin Ryan and I were heading out early in the morning to scout deer during the first week of hunting season. Back then, the early season in northern Vermont opened a week ahead of the southern regions, and the road that we were traveling was mostly forested on both sides, with no houses or utility lines for miles. Just trees, fogs, and the railroad track that cut diagonally across the state. We were driving slowly in Ryan's old pickup, headlights barely cutting through the dense fog that hung low over the road. I remember the air was unusually still that day. Even for that time of year, there was an oppressive quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I was sitting in the passenger seat when I saw a faint vertical light ahead, hanging in the middle of the road. It wasn't moving or reflecting off of anything. It just sort of hovered there, pointing straight up. "Did you see that?" I said. Ryan slowed the truck down a bit and squinted. "Yeah, looks like a flashlight. Somebody must be out there," he said. "I'll hop out and grab it." I shook my head. "I don't know, man. Something about this just doesn't feel right. Let me do it. I'll open the door and take it while you keep the truck running, all right?" He hesitated, then nodded. The truck idled as I stepped out. The fog was thick enough that the light beam barely illuminated the ground near it. I walked a few feet forward and I picked up what turned out to be an old heavy mag light. Nobody was around though. No footprints, no tire tracks in the dirt, nothing. When I got back in the truck, Ryan started driving again, and that's when everything sort of escalated a bit. Small pinpoints of light appeared along both sides of the road. At first, I thought that they were reflections off of tree branches, but the pattern was too deliberate. They were aligned like people standing there. I looked in the rearview mirror and I froze. Figures were visible in the fog, standing just beyond the shoulder of the road, motionless. There had to have been at least 6 or 7 on each side. Ryan stopped the truck, gripping the wheel tightly. I could hear him whispering under his breath, "What the hell?" And then, almost like someone had flipped a switch, they literally just vanished. Not running and not ducking, but just literally blinked and they were gone. The fog remained, the trees were still, but the figures were now gone. And the only evidence that they had been there was the chill in the air and a sinking feeling in my stomach that just never left. We drove the rest of the road in tense silence, neither of us speaking for miles. The feeling of being watched, it lingered, even as the sun rose and the fog began to lift. I've thought about that moment countless times over the years. The area is remote enough that no other hunters would have been out there that early in the morning. Power lines don't run along the section of that road, and there were no cars in either direction, and so I really don't know what to make of it. Years later too, Ryan and I returned to that same road for another hunting trip, and the memory of that morning came back immediately when we reached that same mile marker. The woods, they were quieter than normal, and for a few moments the air itself seemed heavier. We both agreed that we wouldn't stop there again, not even during the day, and I've thought about what it could have been, maybe a prank or something, but I tell this story as objectively as I can. To this day, whenever I drive through remote stretches of northern Vermont, I remember that morning, and I certainly keep my windows up, my speed steady, and my eyes scanning for anything that doesn't belong. If we had have stopped that morning, I really wonder what would have happened. This happened in the summer of 1979 in northern Michigan, near a small town in a dense forested area along the northern shore. So my cousin Melissa was with me, and we were attending a church-affiliated summer camp for a week. The camp itself was on a bluff overlooking the lake, with old cabins scattered along a hillside and a narrow path leading into thick forest behind the property. My mother was one of the counselors there, so she was nearby, but that night she had finished her duties and gone to the main lodge for paperwork, leaving our cabin to the older campers. From the start, too, I felt a bit uneasy. I had always been more sensitive than the other kids, I guess, able to notice subtle things that others ignored, but I was still rational enough to just dismiss most of it. That night, a few of us girls decided to sneak out after lights out to explore a haunted part of the woods too. The local camp legend said that a boy had drowned in the lake decades earlier after wandering onto an old pier that had since fallen into disrepair. Supposedly, he wandered the forest at night trying to find his way back to the camp, and so his spirit now wandered through the woods there. At about 10:30, 10 of us slipped out through the cabin window. We had one flashlight between us and a nearly full moon. Initially, visibility was pretty reasonable, but as we moved deeper into the trees, the moon disappeared behind thick clouds and darkness fell almost immediately. We couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of us, and the forest was silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves from small animals or whatever. We decided to walk in a single file line, each girl placing her hands on the shoulders of the person in front, with me leading because I had the flashlight. After a few minutes, I realized though that something was off. We weren't heading in the direction that we had come from, and the path seemed unfamiliar. That was when I first heard it. A male voice, calm and direct, whispering in my ear, "That way isn't safe, go right." I literally spun my head so fast that the person behind me, they let go of my shoulders in shock, but no one was there. At first, I didn't tell the other girls, and I followed the directions anyway, and over the next 20 minutes, the voice repeated itself intermittently. Eventually, the other girls began experiencing physical sensations too, and we all felt what could only be described as gentle pushes on our shoulders, guiding us off roots, rocks, and uneven ground. It wasn't a shove, it was subtle and enough to redirect our balance though without startling us. The effect moved down the line. Every girl felt it in sequence, repeatedly as well, over at least 24 instances as we moved through this forest. Time became distorted, hours seemed to pass while we wandered, and occasionally we would hear distant snapping branches or low murmurs, but nothing that we could identify. The trees, they were dense, and the fog was rolling in from the lake made everything feel surreal. Eventually the forest opened slightly, and we saw what we thought was solid ground ahead, but it turned out that we were approaching the edge of a bluff overlooking the lake, with nearly a 40-foot drop to rocky shoreline below, which meant that if we had continued in our original direction, we would have fallen for sure, or at least I would have, being the first. But, following the voice's instructions, we veered right and began descending a shallow slope that led to an old, sort of partially collapsed wooden pier jutting into the water. Daylight suddenly revealed that the pier was unstable, with rotten boards, and it was all spaced unevenly. Yet, somehow we crossed without incident, walking in a sort of weaving pattern that traced only the safe planks. Every push that we had felt guided us across, and a single misstep could have caused, well, serious injury. But by around 6 in the morning, we were back at camp, shaken and exhausted. The counselors were initially skeptical. Most attributed our experiences to fear and imagination, though my mother, who had been summoned after a frantic phone call, was visibly concerned. They gathered us in the lodge, and it took nearly an hour to calm everyone enough to give a coherent account, but eventually we did. The following day, as a bit of a safety check, the counselors walked the path with us, and they confirmed that what we had crossed, the bluff, the slope, and the pier, were far more hazardous than any of us even realized. They were shocked to see that our route through the pier was precisely the only visible path, avoiding multiple rotted sections that would have collapsed under our weight for sure. The camp staff, they remained doubtful about the supernatural aspect, and they insisted that we had been lucky and that they would let our parents handle the consequences of sneaking out like that. My mother, however, never doubted that something, whether a guiding presence or something else, had intervened to keep us safe that night. I never returned to that camp, and I've never been in contact with the other girls since then. But every time that I think about it, I remember the forest and the cliff and the pier and the unshakable sense that we were not alone. It wasn't just fear or imagination too. It was precise and deliberate. It was intervention. I still don't know if it was a spirit, a guardian, or something else entirely, but I'm grateful that whatever it was there, because even today, more than 40 years later, I carry that memory as a bit of a warning about underestimating the unknown, because I know that if I had not listened, well, it's very likely that I would not even be here. So this happened a little over a year ago, and honestly, I still feel weird talking about it. I don't usually share stuff like this, but it's been sitting in my head nonstop, and I kinda just want to get it off my chest. So back in late 2023, I had just dropped out of uni in Melbourne. I wasn't failing or anything, I just completely lost interest and couldn't force myself to care anymore. So I picked up a retail job in the CBD because I needed money and figured that it would at least give me some structure. Anyway, this happened on like my third week of working there. It was a Friday morning, around 8:45. I remember the time because I was pretty early and checking my phone every 2 minutes like an idiot. It had been raining all morning, not heavy rain, but just that constant sort of annoying drizzle that soaks everything slowly. The tram stop that I used, it didn't really have a proper shelter, just one of those narrow metal signs and a bit of an overhang from an office building nearby. There were maybe 5 of us standing there, nobody talking, just people doing that silent commuter thing where everyone pretends that the others don't exist. At first, nothing seemed off. Just normal city noise, cars, brakes, people talking somewhere across the street. But then I started hearing yelling. Not loud at first, just distant shouting. I assumed it was someone arguing or maybe construction workers messing around. Stuff like that happens constantly in the city, so I didn't even really look up. But then something hit the pavement across the road. It sounded like somebody had thrown a heavy bag, a really sharp smack sound. A couple of people around me noticed and looked up, but nobody moved yet. And then I saw what it actually was. It was a shoe. Just one shoe lying in the middle of the road. And I remember thinking that that was weird because it hadn't bounced like a normal thrown object. It just dropped straight down like it came from above. I think that my brain started connecting the dots right then, but I didn't want to accept it. But about 2 seconds later, there was another sound, and it was much louder. Like, not even a sound that I can really describe properly. Not like movies, but more like a dull, heavy impact that you feel in your chest before you can even process it. Everyone at the stop turned at the same time because a man had fallen from one of the apartment balconies above the street. He wasn't dead, well, not at least immediately, but that's the part that messed me up the most. He was still moving and making awful noises, like he was trying to breathe but couldn't. Everything after that happened really quickly, but also felt so slow at the same time. People started screaming, someone ran into the road waving cars to stop, a woman nearby called emergency services and was trying to describe what had happened, but she kept breaking down mid-sentence and crying. I really didn't do anything. I just sort of stood there in shock. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. My brain basically shut down. In fact, I remember noticing stupid details, like how one of his socks was still perfectly clean while the rest of him obviously wasn't. My mind just sort of locked onto random things like that instead of processing the actual situation. But then someone from the building above started screaming, and I later realized that it was probably his partner because she was yelling his name over and over again. I also noticed a strange dark figure up there on the balcony where I think he may have fell from. Paramedics arrived really quickly, maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour. They blocked the area off and told everyone to move back. One of them tried to talk to me because I was standing too close, but I couldn't respond. I just stared at them like I didn't understand English anymore. Eventually, a woman who had been standing next to me earlier grabbed my arm and basically pulled me away from the scene. I didn't go to work that day, and I just walked home without really remembering the walk. And that's kind of where the long-term stuff started. At first, I thought that I'd be fine after a few days. People witness accidents all the time, right? I figured that it would just fade, but it really didn't. For months after that, I couldn't walk near tall buildings without constantly looking up, like non-stop scanning balconies and windows. Loud thuds, even something like a dumpster lid slamming, would make my heart start racing instantly. I stopped taking trams and buses completely because waiting at stops made me feel exposed, and I started walking everywhere, even if it took over an hour. Sleeping became a problem too, and I'd jolt awake whenever I heard noises outside, especially if it sounded like something falling. I tried therapy earlier this year, and it helped a bit with panic attacks, but didn't fully fix the hyper-alert feeling. The worst part, though, is that I don't even think about the actual guy that much anymore. It's more like my brain is permanently stuck with watch for danger from above mode sort of thing. Like last month, I was shopping in a shopping center and someone dropped a heavy box from a second floor railing by accident, and it wasn't even close to me, but my body reacted instantly, full adrenaline, shaking hands and tunnel vision. It's frustrating too because logically I know it was a rare freak situation. Statistically speaking, it's not something that I'm likely to ever witness again. But my brain doesn't care about logic. It just remembers that one morning when everything was normal and then suddenly it wasn't. And so, because of all this, I actually started doing some digging into this incident. And I found out that apparently the guy didn't fall, but he was pushed. And the dark figure that I saw, well, that was probably the murderer. I still avoid standing near buildings whenever I can, and honestly, I probably always will at this stage. So I moved in with an old roomie, Cassidy, and her 2 dogs back in August of 2021. We had an apartment for a year prior to moving to the duplex. The new place was on the south end of Columbus, not the best area, but I could deal with addicts and persistent homeless people, no problem. What I couldn't deal with, though, was whatever was actually there. Move-in was normal chaos. Boxes, sleeping on a mattress with your bed frame next to you, painting, etc. Nothing out of the ordinary happening. After a few weeks, I was constantly misplacing things, though. This is far from unheard of for me, but it was sort of out of control. Keys I put in the middle of an empty table wouldn't be there 10 minutes later. I'd start looking for them, and then eventually they'd be back where I left them. This wasn't daily or anything, but enough to mention for sure. Duplex was 2 stories, terrible creaky floors, thin walls, and I could hear my neighbors' farts. And for a bit, it sounded like somebody was walking on the second floor, but nobody was home up there. In the end, I just assumed it was the neighbors, and I could hear them. That assumption, though, was disproven when my neighbors were out on their shared porch and I was inside, and I heard the footsteps and thought, oh, okay, so we really do have a little ghost here. I mean, whatever, I can deal with that. The footsteps were light and always in a sort of quick patter, like a little kid who doesn't know how to skip trying to skip or whatever. I'd get a tap on my shoulder here and there as well, but all harmless stuff. Soon I started hearing my roommate ask for me or say my name when she wasn't home. I never said anything to her in fear of sounding bonkers, but fast forward to like November of 2021, roommate comes to me in the morning and asked if I had anything spooky happen in the house beyond the footsteps and such. I told her then about hearing her ask for me when she wasn't home. She paused and did one of those eyes slightly closed, okay sort of soft nods, told me that she's been having the same thing happen, but obviously me asking for her. She never wanted to say anything for the same reason, but as she was falling asleep last night, her mirror fell. One of those cheap Walmart floor mirrors. Well, It didn't fall technically because it started to tip over, paused for a second, cracked, and then fell. She got freaked out by this, but didn't know if she was just lucid dreaming or what. After she mentioned this and we both acknowledged hearing stuff, it was then that things began to pick up a smidge. The footsteps became more frequent. I had a few taps on my back and would occasionally catch something just in the corner of my eye, but never full on. And I mean, things like this happen, but then nothing crazy happened for a bit. But late January, Cassidy is out for the night and I'm passing out in my bed. I'm in that sort of juicy spot, part comfort and cozy levels reached, and where you know you're about to fall asleep. But then, I feel breath in my ear, and here, I'm downstairs, come on. At that, I get covered in goosebumps. I am now even thinking about it. My phone dings and there's a notification from my security camera downstairs. I immediately text my roommate and surround myself with her dogs. We chat about it the next day and agreed upon, yeah, spooky for sure, but like, what can we do? And we move on. Everything stays the same for a while, until Cassidy moved out mid-April of 2022, and obviously took her dogs with her. And then, everything got wild fast. Within the first week of solo house life, I'm in my room laying in my bed. The foot of my bed faces the door, TV is to the right of it. I'm not sleeping, just sort of chilling watching TV. And from the top of the door frame is a smack 3 times, like undeniably, like an open palm hitting it. Not like, oh, what's that noise, but more like, to heck with that. That night, I go and sleep downstairs. I then move out of my bedroom and into Cassidy's empty room the next day. No issues for a night or two, but I'm on my bed, which is on the floor, not about to take my bed frame apart and reset it up and all that. I think I was either doing nonsense on my phone or something on my laptop, but either way I was doing nothing important. The door to the hallway is across from me in the left corner of the room, and from the hallway, an unfamiliar, wildly uncomfortable noise. The quick little footsteps that I became accustomed to were not like this. They got heavier and slower, pacing down the hallway. Not constant, but enough for me to just hate everything about this. I stand up and go to the door, poke my head into the hallway, and it was then that I have my chest brushed. Not like shoved or pushed, not caressed, but just like, yeah, I can touch you sort of thing. Message received loud and clear. Out loud, I say something like, okay, bud, I'll go. I go to the bed and start packing a bag. My back is at the corner of the room, like against the wall, and I can feel something there with me, like right there. My feelings are confirmed too when over my shoulder, suddenly, I hear a growl. Not like a dog growling, but a distinguishable sound. The best way that I can explain it is if you asked a tired, overweight guy to impersonate an empty stomach. And at that, I dip so fast. I stay at my art studio and I go back during the day and try to push it to the back of my mind while I start packing my stuff. At this point, I'm moving or attempting to. Credit score and financial situation aren't ideal, but I've seen enough horror movies and I know staying helps nothing. After staying at my art studio a few nights and spending the days there packing with no activity, I decided to stay another night. After all, my studio is not the most comfortable place to sleep. First night back, nothing, just the overwhelming fear that it's going to happen again. Second night, nothing. Third night, same. Okay, so maybe I have carbon monoxide poisoning or something the other night. I try to breathe easy, but that stuff was terrifying, so easier said than done, right? Once I somewhat settled back in while continuing to pack up, that was when the footsteps started back up. Things progressed like a heroin addict's tolerance after a quick stint in rehab. Then I started catching little glimpses of it too, where it will be like right at my shoulder, just enough in my peripheral for me to notice that it's there. As soon as my eyes stop focusing on that area and my head turns, there it is, in that corner. A bunch of creepy stuff started happening too at this point. Here are some examples. So I was showering naked, as most people do, right? Recently removed shirt was on the floor leaning on the closed door. I rinsed my face and then my shirt is halfway under the door. My leg was grabbed, like legit pulled while walking up my steps. My little closet door got slammed shut at one point. The house got unbearable, especially upstairs. Like the second that I go up there, it would be right on my back. Not touching me, but like just right there, right out of sight. You could feel it. Every step that I took, it took with me. This wasn't just at night anymore too. It was constant. Keep in mind too that I'm packing up to move, so I really don't have a choice but to be there sometimes. I never go at night anymore, and if I do have to go upstairs to pack, I'm supermarket sweep styling that stuff. But my final to heck with this was at the end of May. I was in my room finishing up packing. My room was hands down the worst spot in the house too. It just did not want me there at all. Its presence in there was so intense, but this time I ended up sprinting out of my house and I just never went back. Looking out of the windows from my room while closing a box, in the reflection, I see it. Sort of like when you look down a well and it's just sort of pitch black. It's like that. It's at my wall, like 7 feet tall, just looming. I turn around, but then it's gone. I'm certainly a bit uneasy, to say the least. It was like a magician coming up with new tricks to wow the audience. Just replace wow with terrify and audience with me, I suppose, but throughout this nightmare, I would often set up my phone along with the security camera. I just wanted to get something to prove that I wasn't bonkers, and this was the last time that I would have to do that. So, like I had done in the past, my trembling hand sets up my terrible iPhone 6 and hits record. I go downstairs and when I come back to check if there was anything there, I run the recording back, and although I can hear footsteps and floor creaks from myself moving around and all that, I hear "get out." And so, at that, I certainly did. On my birthday in May of 2014, I went to the bar with a friend to celebrate. We were sitting on the patio when another of my friends, Steve, showed up at the bar. We were laughing and having a good time. Steve got excited and pointed to his new motorcycle parked across the street. I looked over it and it was like somebody dragged a dark black blanket over my eyes, like a dark storm rolling in over the ocean. I literally saw it. I felt like he was going to die on that machine, and it even slipped out of my mouth to him. He promised me that he would be okay, and so I dropped it. 29 days later, he was driving home on that motorcycle and his front wheel went up on the trunk of the person in front of him. He spun out, and unfortunately, he died there. It's been 10 years and I still think about this. Honestly, I wish I pushed harder about keeping him off that motorcycle, but I didn't. I lost a great friend that year, and I no longer remember his laugh, which was my favorite thing about him. On the other hand, I feel partially responsible for putting that into the universe, sort of like I killed him. I get to live with this the rest of my life, and I'm really sorry that I didn't press harder. I'm sorry that I lived longer than him, and I'm really sorry that he didn't get to see his little sister get married too. I'm sorry that I couldn't face his mother about this. I'm from a small country in South America and attended a religious school. Every year you go to this sort of spiritual getaway in a camp that's situated in an open field next to a small river and this sort of forested mountain area. Said place is beautiful, but gives off an off vibe, I guess. Almost like it's lost in time due to its very old structures. And because of this, the place has been shrouded in mysteries and horror stories. It doesn't help, too, that the whole town was once burned to the ground in a very gruesome war that almost wiped out my country off the map in the 1800s. Anyway, here's what happened. So it was my last year in school, our last camp, and after a long day, all of my class was tired from hiking the forest next to the camp. After dinner and a short stay at the campfire, we were sent to bed that night. My class was made mostly of women. There were very few young men there, only about 6 including me, so we had the whole dorm hall for us, and that was pretty sweet. Now this dorm, which was housing only 6 teens, was a long hall full of bunks made for at least 40 people. Since we didn't have to share, we all chose top bunks next to each other, 3 on my side including me and 3 on the row facing me. It was about midnight and we were just sort of lying there talking, joking and laughing in the dark since the lights were out anyway, when after a couple of minutes I must have fallen asleep. Now, I woke up at what I assume was between maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I rose my head from the sheets to see my best friend in his bunk in front of me, also raising his head. He sort of nods jokingly to the bunk next to him where another classmate was sleeping. He sort of nods jokingly to the bunk next to him where another classmate was sleeping. When I turn, I see the silhouette of my classmate just sort of standing and staring at his bed. I laugh quietly and nod to my friend as to play a prank on him. But then, before we could act, I see the silhouette crouch and notice that my classmate was fully asleep in his bed. Almost at the same time, my friend and I react and look at each other wide-eyed. Both of us cover ourselves in our sheets, doing our best to fall asleep again. Somehow, we eventually managed to do so, but the next morning I went straight to my friend, and before I could finish asking if he saw it too, he just interrupted with a yes, and he told me exactly what he saw. It was the same thing. We approached this classmate and explained it to him. Of course, he thought that we were joking, but both me and my friend remember that event to this day, talking about it every now and then, almost 7 or 8 years after it happened. There was no way that it was one of us because we were all accounted for in our bunks. And so, we have no idea who was standing there that night. Also, it wouldn't have been such a big thing if I was the only one who saw it, but the fact that my friend saw the exact same thing that I did, well, it gave me huge chills. I hope one day that I get an explanation for what happened that night, but somehow I just don't think I will. I used to be a police officer in a city in Virginia. There is one upscale neighborhood in our city with very nice homes. I was always told stories when I was a new officer that there was a doctor who used to live in one of those homes. The story goes that the doctor attempted to perform some type of operation on himself. He numbed his stomach area to make an incision on himself, but since he couldn't feel it, he accidentally cut too far and too deep and accidentally disemboweled himself. When officers and paramedics arrived, he was found barely alive, holding his own intestines, and ultimately died. Fast forward, I was assigned a call about a young female who was found dead by her older sister. When I arrive on scene, it is in the aforementioned nice neighborhood. When I exited my vehicle, I immediately had an uneasy feeling about the house. While nice on the outside, it just had bad energy surrounding it, I suppose. As I approached the front porch, I noticed countless empty energy drink cans and a Ouija board on the front patio table. Everything about this house just felt off and wrong, but when I was let inside, the family was obviously very distraught. I was told that the deceased sister, her name was Emily, was in the basement. At this point, another officer had arrived too, and so he stayed upstairs with the family as I entered the basement. The basement was unfinished and was fairly dark, minus 2 pull-string light bulbs, one on each side of the basement. The scene in the basement was similar to the front porch though. Energy drink cans were everywhere, and another Ouija board was on a small coffee table. Emily, who was 19 if I remember correctly, was hanging by her neck on a basement rafter. She had unfortunately ended her own life with an exercise band and was swinging back and forth slightly. It was a horrible sight, and another officer helped me lift her to bring her down. Emily's family consisted of her mother and father and her older sister. Her parents stated that they had been trying to help her because all she ever did was drink energy drinks to stay up all hours of the night, playing on the Ouija board. Her sister gave a little bit more detail about it. Being sisters, she stated that they were very close and told each other everything pretty much. Her older sister said that Emily indeed had been obsessed with the Ouija board, drinking energy drinks to stay up all night and talk to what she believed was her boyfriend, who was dead. Her sister stated that Emily had been saying that her boyfriend was begging for her to come join him in the afterlife, and so she believed that this is why she did what she did. Now, let me reiterate, this house felt wrong. Everything felt bad, and I had a very uneasy and sick feeling being in that basement, and not because of the dead body. After all, it definitely wasn't my first. This is a call that really messed me for a while though, and we really never got much more explanation, and as cops you kind of just have to move on to the next call. But 2 weeks later to the day, I get a call about a car accident with ejection. I head to the call, code 1, lights and sirens, and arrive to find a convertible BMW with the top down, which had experienced an obvious horrible crash and rollover. I was sitting on its wheels, and in the driver's seat was a woman who clearly had a broken neck, as her head was almost all the way turned around. Next to the vehicle, about 25 feet away though, was a man who had been ejected. Keep in mind this was a convertible, so he was ejected from the top of the car, and let's just say that it was a horrible scene. I went to close off the scene with some yellow tape. I walked about 75 yards away from the accident, where I found yet another chunk of the guy. I'm not trying to be intentionally graphic here, but I want to paint the picture of just how bad and violent this car accident was. Upon obtaining the man's ID, I read the information off to the dispatch, and then another officer and I both realized the same thing at the same time. These two people, they were Emily's parents, who 2 weeks to the day just died in a horrible way. And I tell you that breaking the news to the older sister was absolutely heartbreaking. In fact, I kept in touch with her for a little while after this. She had inherited her parents' estate and all of the life insurance money, etc. She ended up selling off everything and buying a different house to try and start over and repair her broken life. However, it doesn't end here, because around a month later, another officer was called after a pedestrian was struck by a car while she was jogging in her neighborhood. And yes, you guessed it, it was the sister. She managed to survive several weeks in a coma, but ultimately, she just didn't make it. If you're wondering why this story about the doctor is relevant, it's because the house that Emily killed herself in was the same house that the doctor lived in. I don't know what you guys think, but to me it definitely seems like either that house is cursed or Emily opened up something really bad. That was all a few years ago now, and I'm no longer a police officer. I moved a couple of states away, and twice now I've found 2 different Ouija board planchettes on the sidewalk when going to check my mail. I never touch them, obviously, and usually use a stick or something to push them into the storm drain, but coincidence? I'm not so sure. I grew up in a fairly rural area of Virginia. As a kid, I had an obsession for dirt bikes, watching motocross on TV, the X Games, reading Racer X magazines. It was all I thought about. So when my mum and dad bought me my first dirt bike one Christmas, I was ecstatic. From that moment too, my days were consumed with riding that thing. As soon as I got home from school until sundown pretty much, you could bet that I was in those woods somewhere riding around. Right behind my parents' house was a huge expanse of woods, There was a trail that ran virtually the entire length of our neighborhood. It was a point-to-point trail with a few turns, hills and jumps. It would take about 15 minutes on my dirt bike to ride the length of the trail from end to end. There were no other trails too, just this one long trail. And when I got to the end, I would just turn around and go back the other way. I would ride back and forth for hours pretty much every day. I ended up learning that trail like the back of my hand, where every tree root was, where every turn was, where every rut was. I mean, you get the picture. Now, when I was 13, I started having this reoccurring dream. I would be riding my dirt bike along that familiar trail when suddenly there would be a new intersection, a brand new trail to go down. I would ride down it and come to a large clearing in the woods. In my dream, I had this feeling that when I got to the clearing, I was supposed to be looking for something, finding something there. But every time I got to the clearing, I would always wake up. This reoccurring dream continued as well until I was about 14. I left my house one afternoon, hopped on my dirt bike like normal, and began another afternoon of riding back and forth on the trail. I rode for around an hour when it happened. I was heading up a small hill mindlessly by this point, knowing everything to expect. Coming over the hill, though, I saw it. There, all of a sudden, was the intersection. I locked my rear brakes, causing the rear end to slide sideways slightly. I couldn't believe my eyes. Was this real? I sat there for several minutes, my bike's motor idling, staring down the trail. 1,000 thoughts suddenly raced through my head. I mean, how was this possible? Was it always here? Looking down the trail, I couldn't see the end of it. It went straight for about 50 yards, but I couldn't make out what was at the end. It was as if I couldn't focus on it clear enough. It was just sort of a straight trail, though, I guess. It matched exactly what was in my dream, though. And so, in the end, I decided not to go down it, almost not believing that it was really there. I told myself that if it was there again tomorrow, then I would go down it. Anyway, the next day came and I again ventured out into the woods. I rode straight to the spot where I saw the new trail, fully expecting for it to be gone, but sure enough, there it was again. I made the turn at the intersection, and that's when I slowly began riding down the trail. I drove down the trail, staying in third gear, slow and steady. The trail was completely straight, and it only took me about a minute to reach it. The clearing, that is. The exact clearing that I always saw in my dreams. Dumbfounded, I sort of stopped, put my kickstand down, turned off the motor, and got off my bike. I took off my helmet, looking around. What the heck, I whispered to myself. The clearing itself was a perfect circle, around 50 feet in diameter. It was surrounded by dense forest, minus the single trail leading to it, obviously. I couldn't make sense of this, though. I thought that I was losing my mind or something. I walked around the circle confused, contemplating what it all meant, and looking around for answers. I began to feel an eerie feeling, though, all of a sudden, as if I was being watched. A feeling of dread and danger suddenly crept up the back of my neck. I felt as if I was suddenly somewhere that I was very much not supposed to be. Man, to heck with this, I said. I threw my helmet back on, not bothering to buckle it, and I kick-started my dirt bike, bringing life back to the motor. I peeled back down the trail, shifting gears, and I hauled butt back home. I rode for a few minutes when it suddenly hit me, though. Why the heck is it taking so long to get back? I mean, it took less than a minute to reach the clearing, yet I've been riding down this trail for what felt like was several minutes, and I hadn't met back up with my familiar trail yet. At that, I started to panic, getting disoriented. I told myself, maybe I'm just going the wrong way. I knew that it didn't make sense, but I was willing to try anything to get out of there at that moment. I spun the bike back around, and within about 10 seconds, I made it back to the clearing all of a sudden. I peeled around again, back down the trail. Again I rode and rode, never making it back to the intersection though. I stopped, got off my bike, feeling defeated, confused, and a little bit scared now. I threw my helmet and collapsed next to a tree, sobbing. On my knees, I let out a frustrated and terrified scream, I guess. I sat there trying to think of what to do next. I'm not sure how long I sat there for, but it felt like hours. I could see the sun dropping in the sky, the woods getting dimmer. I started to feel like I was never going home. So I closed my eyes and somehow, probably out of mental exhaustion, I must have fallen asleep with my back against a tree. I'm really not sure how long I slept for, but I woke up, immediately jumped to my feet, wildly looking around and quickly gathering my bearings. And it was then that I realized that the sun was shining brightly and I was now back on the trail, my blessed familiar trail. The intersection and the new trail were still there, but somehow I was out. Quickly, I jumped onto my bike, riding as fast as I could to get home. I had no idea how long I was gone for and thought that my parents were probably worried sick. Exiting the woods by my house, I parked my bike and I quickly ran inside. "Hi, honey," my mum said. "I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I just lost track of time." I managed to get out. "Well, it's only been an hour. I'm surprised you're already back inside, actually," my mum said. I stood there, mouth agape, staring at my mum. "Are you okay, sweetie?" my mother asked me, and a look of concern was suddenly growing on her face. I forced out an awkward smile. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just not feeling well, I think." I went to my room and a million questions were running through my mind. I spent the next few days confused, replaying every moment through my head. I wanted to just make sense of, well, everything, to have some logical reason for it all, but there just wasn't any. In the end, I devised a plan, though, that, looking back, was honestly incredibly stupid, but I couldn't live with not knowing what the heck happened to me in those woods that day. Now, my dad was a bit of a tool connoisseur. Any tool, hardware, rope, bungee cords, he was your guy. And among his collection, he had a giant spool of yellow rope, around 600 feet of it. I decided that I was going to use that rope, tie it to a tree at the intersection, and then ride back down the trail to investigate. The rope, it would serve as my lifeline, helping guide me back when I was ready to leave. And that day, I went back out. Getting to the trail intersection, I tied one end of the rope around my waist and used several bungee cords to tie the spool to a tree, giving me slack but staying secured to the tree. And afterward, I headed back down the trail. Feeling a new boost of confidence and determination, I rode back down that trail and quickly arrived back to the clearing. I kept one hand on the knot on my waist, being sure that it stayed there. I got off my bike, leaving it idling, and walked into the middle of the circle. I started to get that eerie feeling again, as if I was being watched, but this time I shook it off. A new feeling of bravery had suddenly come over me. I felt determined to discover what it was that we were supposed to find here, and what the point of all this was. I forced down the feeling of dread. Scanning the clearing, I suddenly became fixated on one tree in particular. This tree was darker than the rest, almost looking burned maybe. I got closer to it. Flaky, black, scorched marks covered the tree. I was staring at the tree, almost feeling stuck in place, when suddenly something began slowly peeking its head out from behind it. The face was black, burned, decayed, and not human. Almost like a bad imitation of one. It had short, wiry black hair that looked oily and covered in soot. And as soon as its eyes met mine, my dirt bike's motor shut off all of a sudden. The silence caused me to turn around to look at my bike, then I quickly turned back. But when I did, the thing was gone. Eerily though, the woods suddenly became very silent. For a split second, I froze too, until instinct in my body kicked in and told me to get the heck out of there quickly. I sprinted back to my bike, kick-started it harder than I ever had. I half expected it to not start, but to my relief, it had started. I left my helmet behind, riding as fast as I could. The image of the thing's eyes burned into my mind. In my haste to leave, I made a fatal mistake though. Having walked a good ways past my bike into the clearing, I had created way too much slack in the rope when heading back the opposite direction. I was shifting gears, going faster and faster, when suddenly the rope caught my chain. My rear wheel locked and I was sent straight over the handlebars. Although in pain, I got to my feet as quickly as I could, dirty, limping, a burning pain in my ribs. The rope was still tied around my waist, but it had somehow been severed in the crash. Frantically, I looked around for the rest of the rope, the end that would lead me back, but it was just gone. I ran to my bike in any case and trying desperately to get the pieces of the rope out of my chain and sprocket, when I saw it. Movement from the corner of my eye. I stopped, froze, looking in the direction of the movement. I then saw more movement again out of the corner of my eye. It was as if it was, I don't know, anticipating my moves, staying just out of eyesight, darting between the trees almost. I took off running down the trail, abandoned my bike. My adrenaline was pumping and I knew that I was running for my life. I then spotted the yellow rope, that beautiful yellow rope. I literally screamed yes, running as quickly as I could toward it, following it to salvation. But the rope, it began retracting, dragging on the ground, back up the trail. No, I screamed, running as fast as I could toward it. I ran after it as it seemed to run away from me. I was hoping to see the intersection, praying that it would be there. And then, all of a sudden, I did. I reached the intersection, crying, heaving, trying and failing to catch my breath. For a second, I felt pure relief for making it out alive, but that was when I noticed something. The yellow rope. The spool was no longer bungeed to the tree. The rope now led behind the tree. Slowly, it stepped out from behind the tree, revealing itself in its entirety. It was the thing from the clearing. The woods suddenly fell silent again. A feeling of pure dread came over me. It had a look of pure malice in its gaze, and a terrible smile as it continued to gather up the rest of the yellow rope. I was frozen in fear. I felt as if I was in ice water. I couldn't catch my breath, couldn't scream. I just stood there frozen. I can only describe what I saw as a distorted imitation of a human. Black, charred, its form twisted and contorted into a grotesque mockery of life. Its eyes were pools of endless darkness, devoid of empathy or humanity, gleaming with an ancient predatory intelligence. It then began to move toward me, slowly. Weirdly though, its steps were completely silent, and the air around me suddenly grew cold and carried a stench of like decay or something. With each movement, its body sort of shifted and rippled too, as if it was sort of struggling to contain its own shape. Its presence filled me with an overwhelming dread, a primal fear that seized my entire being. Its voice was terrible too, a twisted mixture of a whisper and a scream almost. I felt as if its gaze seeped into my mind, into my very being, turning my thoughts into twisted and nightmarish desires. And as it approached closer and stood over me, I honestly thought that I was about to die. And then suddenly, everything just went black. I woke up back on my familiar trail, the intersection now gone, the rope now gone, no trace of anything was left. I was in shock and in pain, and I walked back home. In the end, I told my parents that I had crashed my dirt bike and wasn't strong enough to push it back home. My dad went back into the woods to look for it, but he never could find it. Honestly, I didn't care. I was never going to touch another dirt bike for the rest of my life as far as I was concerned. Since then, though, everything has felt different. I feel like something is missing in me, as if that thing took something from me. I know that that's weird, but I felt unable to enjoy anything, unable to have relationships, unable to care. I struggle to sleep. I don't even really feel tired. I just couldn't really feel anything anymore. I didn't know what to do. I just felt like a shell. That Christmas, though, my family and I were getting ready to leave for a Christmas tree farm, an annual tradition that used to bring me excitement. My parents were trying their best, and they saw the change in me. Everyone did. Putting on brave faces, my parents asked me if I was excited to pick out a tree. I wasn't excited, not at all. I couldn't be excited about anything anymore. Sure, I said, trying my best to sound convincing. Before we left, though, my dad was digging in the garage looking for something. Hey, Bud, have you seen my yellow rope? The question sent me into a flashback of full terror, leaving me screaming, sobbing, and begging for help, begging for it to stop. From then on, I spent years in and out of therapy and even institutions. I am an adult now, but I've just never shaken the feeling of pure emptiness. I decided that I'm going to go back to my childhood home, back to that familiar trail that I can still remember like the back of my hand. If the intersection is there, then I'm going to go back down it. In fact, I've decided that I'm going to try to kill that thing and get back the piece of myself that it clearly took. Well, if it kills me, taking the rest of me, well, so be it. Either way, I don't want to live like this anymore, and I'm going to be free of this. I grew up in a century house. I think it was 105 years old in 1985, so very, very old. It was beautiful, but I hated the vibes there. Always felt nasty and sort of unclean. Between the ages of 3 and 8, though, I would see a fuzzy, misty sort of apparition that would play peekaboo with me in the mornings as I lay in bed. At first, it would be misty and become intermittently more solid, waxing and waning in its visibility like power surges. For a long time, I would stare, especially on weekends when I slept in and had time to ponder, thinking that I was half asleep, but I would count, spell words, do my ABCs, later recite prime numbers, pinch myself, move about to make sure that I was awake, and I can assure you that I always was. I'm a pretty straightforward person, always have been, but I couldn't believe my eyes. But then I got used to it, and it would just keep playing peekaboo as I read my books and magazines, when I got some cereal, sometimes take a bath and came back and read. Later, when I got a TV, I would watch cartoons and it would be there. It sort of became my morning ghost buddy, I guess. I did my thing and it did its thing. It was a misty shape of a head and shoulder and featureless but semi-solid. I could see through it, but also it was like staticky and would sometimes be more obvious and then sort of fade back to a less solid fog. Also, it sort of looked like moving particles if you stared long enough. Like static from a TV, but more white. It didn't feel scary, I guess, but just odd to me. It was almost like I was witnessing something highly unusual, and it was sort of bemusing. A phenomena of sorts, I guess. Anyway, the freakiest part is that it was doing the little peek thing at the top corner of the 10-foot door frame. Sometimes a little more than the head and shoulders would move out, and it would be an amorphous blob, but it's like there was a barrier and it couldn't move far beyond the doorframe. I don't even know if it was actually truly conscious enough to be playing with me, or it was sort of stuck there at the frame and doing its thing, but I sort of felt like it had some intention. Just a feeling I had, but that's what it was. Eventually it would stop, or the light got so bright that it would not be discernible, but I think it stopped about mid-morning. I never saw it at night or dusk or any time during the day if I took a nap. This was only in the morning hours, between dawn and say 10 or 11 a.m. Eventually I just stopped seeing it too. It could be because I started closing my bedroom door at night as I got older and wanted privacy, but I'm not so sure. Looking at the history of the house that was built by a distant relative who owned a sawmill and local hotel, he was a bad actor from what I understand. At some point there was a fire shortly after the house was first erected in the 1880s, and the stairwell and the upper floor were damaged and reconstructed. Not a devastating fire that killed anyone, but the stairwell and the foyer on the second floor by my bedroom was not the original, but 20 years or so younger. Maybe that guy though, maybe he killed somebody there because he was a southern gangster of sorts and was involved in getting rid of some folks, or so it's said. Some people did pass away at the house of old age and natural causes. Wakes were held there, so maybe a ghost. Appalachia is old with history, predating the settlers, so who knows. But to my knowledge, no dramatic deaths, and my family are all about knowing the scoop on the family drama, so we could never find anything there. Also, the house eventually burned down due to electrical issues during renovations after we sold it in the 90s. But it had a majorly creepy vibe in some of the rooms also, like a feeling of dread and sort of sadness, I think. I had a playroom in the attic, and sometimes I would be playing in there and feel like I was being watched, and the hair on my arms would actually stand up like fear or static in the air, and my ears would start to ring too. I describe it a bit like the air changed, like when you go to higher altitudes and your ears pop, or when the silence becomes audible. A shift in silence from normal silence to sort of complete and thick silence. It was a total atmospheric shift, a pressure change. I would be so afraid that I would almost get a freeze response, but I somehow knew not to react like that. Like I was scared, but to put my things away per usual and calmly leave like normal without freaking out or getting hurried. As I got older, I have heard some bad energies feed on fear, so it's interesting as a kid that I knew in my gut not to react like that. Just sort of remove myself, but don't overreact. I've always had a good poker face, and maybe that's why, I don't know, but I also don't scare easily, even in situations that would warrant panic. I'll freak out later, but in the moment I just try to stay cool, like autopilot or going numb, which is good in times when you need your wits. That's the first time that I remember engaging in that mode, about 5 or 6 years old in my attic playroom. Another story too is that we lived in a mountainous area foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. At the base of the mountain there was a huge cotton field. It was pretty beautiful actually, but I would freak out when I saw it. My mum said that it started as a toddler, but I would look at the field as we drove by and I would start hyperventilating, whimpering and get tearful. Later, when I got older, around 5, and learned what was up, I would just hide under a blanket until we passed it to manage my exposure. As I got even older, I would just look at it and try to figure out what about it vexed me. It was a stunning visage, beautiful and picturesque. Nothing that I know of happened there, like a battle or recent bad history or anything. But my mind saw something my eye could not, and it was freaky, and for whatever reason I hated it. As an adult, I no longer get that feeling at all when I see the field. Just a peaceful place, I guess. People even take pictures in the late summer and fall when the cotton blooms there. Also, there's sunflower fields adjacent to it, and that's pretty glorious. It's a sunny patch in the middle of the mountains. A valley with meadows, and coming off of the mountain you get a bird's eye view, and it's honestly like no other. But as a kid, for whatever reason, I wanted to walk a wide circle around it, and I mean a very wide circle. My grandfather's family had lived in the mountains of very rural central Pennsylvania since the 1700s. In the 1890s, my great-great-grandfather built an expansion onto a house or loft that his father, born in 1829, had built. The house still stands today, and we still go there most weekends in the summer, as it's 8 miles from a very large and beautiful lake. I've been going there since I was a kid, and we call it the old house. The house is filled with very old photos. Some of the photos we know the ancestors in them, some we actually don't. Some of the photos, though, are very creepy. When I was a child, probably about, 9 or 10 years old, we went for a weekend in the summer. I had one pair of sandals that I was wearing, and I would always take them off next to the fireplace, which didn't work anymore. On the morning that we had to leave to go back home, the sandals that I was wearing were now gone. They weren't next to the fireplace anymore. Both my parents and my grandfather, who was there, searched the entire house high and low for my sandals, but they could never find them. Keep in mind that this house is not very large. They searched for hours too before they finally gave up, and I made the 2-hour ride back home without my shoes. My grandfather stayed at the house for another day before going back home. When my grandfather woke up the next day, the sandals, they were right there next to the fireplace where I had left them. My family still talks about this to this day. My grandfather told my mum that they must have not wanted her to leave. I've always loved this house and have felt very close to my ancestors while in it, but that was pretty creepy. Anyway, I went to the house last summer with my daughter and my friend. I set a vape pen down on the kitchen table. My daughter and friend were outside picking apples off of an apple tree behind the house. We were due to leave the house that morning. I went outside to load up my car, and when I came back in, the vape pen was not on the kitchen table. Nobody else had been in the house between the time that I had set the pen on the table and the time that I had come back in. We searched the entire house, and there was just no vape pen to be found. I and my family members have been back at that house half a dozen times since last fall when this happened, and no vape pen was ever found or recovered. My ancestors never drank or smoked, from what my grandfather tells us. My mum tells me all the time that it was them telling you to stop. Not super scary or anything, but it is definitely completely unexplainable. I have always felt a crazy deep connection to that house too, and have taken it upon myself to research and gather a lot of information about my ancestors who lived on that land. I am the oldest grandchild, and one day that house will become mine, as we always pass it down to the oldest member of the family, per my great-great-grandfather's will. Weirdly enough too, I seem to be the only person whose belongings always go missing in that house. So I live in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philly, and the following happened a few years ago. It was a late November evening, and my wife and I were craving wings that day. A quick search brought up a new joint in Royersford, PA, that had just opened. I put in an online order, and then I zip on by. The man behind the counter, middle-aged African-American gentleman with a jovial disposition and a hearty laugh. We talked about the Eagles while he got my food ready. Eventually I thanked him and I left. A few months later, he is in the news, apparently, for killing his business partner, apparently over a money dispute. She had funds and he wanted them for a new location, but she allegedly refused. He buried her outside of an industrial area and parked her car elsewhere. The police found evidence of him being in her car, several failed attempts to get access to her Cash App or Venmo account, evidence of a struggle in her home, and before long, Chicken Wing Guy was actually arrested, tried, and convicted of his business partner's murder. I didn't connect it immediately too until later that this was the same guy who had served me after an article named the business that he owned. It was the very restaurant that I got wings at a few months prior. The wings, they weren't good at all as I recall too, but he was a convicted murderer and I was served by him. My grandma's property is settled all the way in the back of the woods at the end of a long unpaved road. Along with being comically bumpy, it also has a history of hauntings that were passed between family members over the years. I myself was somewhat skeptical of these tales, not because I'm not a believer of the paranormal, but because my uncle and father have a habit of being very exaggerative. Until one night, about a year ago. Back then, I lived with my grandma down at the end of that road, and at the time, I also didn't own a car. As such, my boyfriend had to walk to my house from the entrance of the road, since his parents didn't want to risk damaging their vehicles on the aforementioned bumpy road. Mind you, this road is a good 20 minutes walk from the beginning to the end, completely overgrown with bushes and trees, and has a puddle every other step. So more often than not, I'd meet him about halfway, and then walk him back to the entrance once he went home. That night, when we were walking back to the entrance, I decided to tell him about the property's haunted history. From the silver buried on four corners of the property to appease a supposed deer spirit, to the knocking on the counters at night, I spilled every tale that I'd ever heard. Now, unlike me, he was genuinely afraid of such tales, as he himself had once had an experience very similar, albeit much more terrifying, to the one that I was about to have. He warned me not to do one thing: don't whistle at night. Now, a thing to know about me, I'm a habitual whistler and tend to do it without even thinking about it. So, of course, on my way back, I began to sing a tune. That particular night, it was unusually bright outside for being so late. The sky was still a dull blue and there was hardly a shadow despite being well past 8:30. I got into the quarter mark of the road, an almost gateway of bushes on a small ridge going further into the road, when I heard something. A yell that very, very distinctly sounded like an old man. Later, once I got home, I'd realized that there was a word in that yell too: help. At the time, I didn't think too much of it, which, yes, was especially dumb of me, I know. I'd love to pull out every excuse under the sun, but I was evidently feeling very stupid that night. Now that I've had time to think about it too, I've noted two things. One, there was no possible way that there could have been an elderly man on or near the road. My grandma is the only person that lives on that end of the road. Second, as I mentioned, was the word in the yell: help. My boyfriend, after hearing the story, said it was meant to be a lure, but for what? Me? Death? All that fun stuff? As I walked, I got to the halfway mark of the road. A field of dead yellow grass and a single fallen tree on the left-hand side of the road lay there. I'd seen it hundreds of times before, and every time I'd thought, why is that tree still there? As I took my courtesy look at the tree, that was when I noticed something, or someone. It. To this day, I don't know what I saw, to be honest. It wasn't a cryptid, not a monster nor a demon, but standing a good 30 feet away from the tree was, honest to God, and what I can only describe it as, was a sheet ghost. A simple, rounded pillar of white, nearly 8 feet tall, and as still as the tree before it. It stood there. And it saw me, too. I know it did. It had no eyes, no face, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I had never truly known fear before that night, but I froze in place and felt like a mouse beneath a cat's paw, caught and hopeless. Faster than I could blink, it ducked behind the tree and seemed to stay there. 30 feet traversed in under a second. Once it was behind the tree, it stayed there and I could move again. The sensible among you probably think that I ran, but I didn't. I didn't want to get its attention again. 10 minutes of absolute silence and paranoia as I walked home. I was utterly terrified. I got home and there sat my grandma on her little red couch smoking a cigarette. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she chuckled. Well, to be honest, I think I had. I have gotten all kinds of answers over the years for what I saw. Skinwalker, Wendigo, hide behind. For now, I just want to share my story and let speculation generate more ideas as to maybe what I saw. So, if you have any ideas, then please do share. I just recently remembered this story from when I was quite young, so I figured that I could share it here, as looking back, it's, well, kind of creepy. So I grew up in the Midwest, a little north of Chicago. When I was probably around 12, a friend and I saw some deer behind his house. There was a large field behind it that a forest bordered, so it wasn't uncommon for deer to be there. Being kids, we wanted to go and pet the deer, so we slowly approached them. We walked across the field to them so that we wouldn't spook them. Looking back, the deer really should have ran. Two big creatures walking towards a herd of deer really should have spooked them, but they all just kind of kept on eating the grass and standing there. I was in front of my friend, so I got a closer look at the deer than he did. I would guess that I was maybe about 6 feet away from this deer when it finally looked up at me. That was when I noticed her knees and saw that they were bloodied. I just figured that it was because she had previously laid down on them or something and got scratched up. I looked up at her face and I was filled with fear. Something that was very unlike me as a kid, and so we ran. Now remembering this later, something that I didn't think about at the time as strange was the fact that her knees were actually facing the wrong way. Not like they were broken, but like they had grown to be the wrong way. Of course, she could have had a defect or something like that, but everything combined with the feeling of dread that I felt looking into her eyes, it creeps me out all these years later. If anyone has any thoughts on this, then please do share, because, I don't know, it could be nothing, but it definitely was freaky. At the time that this all happened, I must have been about 9 years old. I was in bed one night and heard the radio in the kitchen going. My mum would almost always work the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, but on Tuesdays would take the mid shift because we would have family night on Wednesdays. I assume it must have been a Tuesday when this happened because my mum was in fact home. My mum worked a lot, and 22 days out of the month most months, so it was not uncommon for us to try to help when she was up late cleaning. Anyway, as I walked down the stairs, I noticed that all the lights in the house downstairs were off and just the kitchen light was on. This already had me running for the kitchen because our walls were a deep green. As I mentioned before, my mum worked the late shift, and my dad purposefully painted the living room area a dark color so that when the lights were out and the blackout curtains were closed, it would be dark enough for my mum to fall asleep after work. As I entered the kitchen, my mum was at the sink, and when I thought about it afterward, I only heard the radio going downstairs, not the sink, but she was washing dishes when I walked in. In any case, her back was turned to me, so I couldn't see her face. I asked, "Mum, do you want some help cleaning?" But she didn't answer me. I asked a second time, and this time there was a bit of a moaning as an answer. This didn't immediately alarm me because it didn't sound like a zombie or anything moaning, more like a, I don't know, kind of moan, if that makes sense. I just replied with, "Okay, well, if you want me to help, just let me know." She didn't turn around, but she kind of, stiffened a bit. So I took that as my cue to get out and just let her be. Sometimes she just wanted to clean in peace, as she worked with older people and many would die on her watch. My mum is a dedicated nurse when it comes to her patients because she worked in a rehabilitation center. Many of these patients would get dropped off by their families and literally never see them again. She would often take us to see them when she could so that they could feel like someone cared for them. So, still no alarms went off as I walked back towards the stairs, as I assumed someone may have died and she was sad and wanted to just be left alone. When I hit the corner to round and go up the stairs though, everything in the kitchen just shut off at once. The radio, the sink, the lights, all of it. Man, when I tell you that I ran up those stairs to my room, I was gone. zoomed past my brother's and parents' room and ran into mine, slammed my door shut and jumped under the covers. I was thinking at the time that this is the end. My parents are big horror fans, and they didn't believe in shielding us from stuff like that because they wanted us to understand the difference in what was real and what was not, and that no matter what, God is there and he'll protect us and all that. And I can tell you that I did not feel God that night. I suddenly hear my door burst open though, and my mum yells at me for running up the stairs, thinking that I had gone and grabbed candy or something and run up the stairs to avoid her. I said, "No, Mum, you scared me when you turned everything off." And she was like, "What are you talking about?" And I tell her what just happened. She tells me that I must have dreamt it up and quickly tucks me into bed, and she just closes my door. Now, the next day I asked her why she would do that to me when she knows that I'm scared of the dark like that. I truly thought that she just thought it wasn't as funny to me when she saw how scared I was or something and tucked me in to calm me down. She then tells me, though, that she was apparently in her room. She had gotten home, took off her shoes, and went straight to her room that night. She never went into the kitchen, never heard me go down the stairs, but instead assumed that my brothers had left me down there because I fell asleep as they used to do it, knowing that I was scared of the dark and thought that it was funny. When I ask her about it now, she only vaguely remembers this happening. My brothers had bad experiences in this house though as well, and they actually believed me. The common factor that I find in our stories is that they all had to do with downstairs for whatever reason. None of us ever had scary stuff happen upstairs, but generally agree that something was weird about that kitchen and the fireplace too. The stories always seem to include one of both of those two things, and to this day, I still don't know who or what I spoke to that night. Almost 20 years ago now, I was traveling up and down Chile for a while with my friends, backpacking, essentially. But we had some friends here and there, and one of our home bases was the parents of one in our group. His stepfather was a natural doctor. Awesome, right? Except I contracted something severe at one point in the Atacama Desert, and over the course of 3 weeks, while my friends continued on, I was slowly dying while this dude was giving me 30 drops of this and that, or 46 of this and that. And at one point, as I was convulsing in their bathtub, the mother decided enough was enough and I had to go to the hospital. After this, I just remember the feeling of the winter's grass on my heels as I ran down a giant hill to where my friends were. I remember the feeling in my chest. I wanted so bad to reach them. I arrived and no one noticed at all. I observed them for what felt like more than a minute. After running upon them and no one even flinching, it was startling, but it made me stay perfectly still and just listen. And then in the blink of an eye, a woman who I'd never met before, but looked so weirdly like me, suddenly was to my left, and she said, "Go back now." It wasn't a threat, it was like a mother tells a toddler. I don't know, but I immediately turned around and, in a weird sort of urgent but joyful sense, I ran back up this wet, thick hill without seeing or speaking to her again. And I woke up in the hospital to a man almost laughing, telling me that he'd never seen someone so dry that was still alive. But the weirdest thing is that I later confirmed the actual conversations my friends were having that I observed that day, and I have no explanation for that whatsoever. I don't remember reaching the top of the hill or anything, just my hands grabbing at ferns and that I was wet, like as if I was running up a hill in my home, which is always wet, it's rainforest, and I was totally dehydrated, completely for weeks at that point. I remember climbing in the ground and my toes in mud and my hand on ferns, and then the doctors just smiling at me with their faces. What I heard them talking about was just so mundane too. One of my friends was talking about agricultural class where you meet the cows with holes in their stomachs. She was describing how they keep everything hygienic. A random conversation to have with a history and political science major, and honestly nothing that I would have had any prior knowledge about too. But she was basically describing the hole and what goes on with it and all that. Like I said, I reiterated this to them and they confirmed that this was actually what they were talking about. And it was in the location that I saw in my, well, whatever that state was. Many things in my life have been very spooky, but a pinnacle event always stands out. I worked in a cemetery that was built on the grounds of a carriage house that burned down, taking at least one human and some horses with it. Now, there was also a pauper's grave of unknown remains transplanted from a tiny rural graveyard there too. And one Saturday, I was on duty and very, very aware of the male shadow figure who lurked around the office. You could hear him walking with a cane up and down the hall. It always put me on edge. He felt ominous and disquieting. I had a burial that day and the family no-showed. Later on, I swore that I heard someone in the lobby down the hall from my office though, but when I got there, they were gone. I assumed it was the family and rushed out to find them. We played Ring Around the Rosies with a huge funeral home between us. Finally, I realized there were no cars in the lot besides mine, and I hadn't caught a glimpse of someone just rounding a corner since a lap ago, so perhaps they left? Later on, I was in the giant vault that doubled as our records room. When my back was turned, the door slammed shut. It can only be opened with a key from the inside, and guess what wasn't on me, as well as my cell phone. Panic took a while to set in, and no matter what I did, I just could not get that door to open. I could, meanwhile, distinctly hear a man chuckling outside, though. Sitting against the door, calculating how many hours till Monday got here, and the likelihood of the grounds guys coming into the lobby and seeing the normally open vault door was closed. Before I could talk myself really off of the deep end, the door suddenly bolted open, and I flopped back, knocking myself off the metal threshold. Hours later, I woke up after apparently being knocked out. The sound of a dull shuffle stepped near my ear, oddly startling me. Or maybe I got a sudden whiff of the familiar leathery cologne that lingered in the clouds around the building, inexplicably. Either way, I was awake and I wasted no time in locking up and leaving. So I live in Virginia in an old plantation, and there's a cemetery right up the road from here. My sister, she is also super spiritual and is in contact with psychics and all that live near us. I don't believe in any of that. But one time she called her and told her, "Don't go outside at night because the deers aren't actually deers." Weird, right? Anyway, we have seen some circles of bones. My sister and her friend have also been chased through the woods by something. And if you're outside at night, it kind of sounds like there's double the amount of footsteps sometimes that there's supposed to be. That could just be paranoia, I admit, but other people have recognized it too. I've also always been like I don't believe in the paranormal sort of stuff. There's always a reason for something. So it's not like I normally jump to paranormal conclusions. But I don't know, this one just seems different. So last night at like 3 a.m, I know it's kind of ironic, it's the devil hour and all that, but it really was 3. I was outside smoking at this little burnt up shed in front of my house listening to music. I turned my music off because I was about ready to go inside. I stand up to put my jacket on and stretch and all that. And then something just screams. Absolutely belts out a scream. I've listened to foxes and owls that do the same thing, but honestly, it sounded nothing like those. Whatever it was, its scream sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. I was standing there, scared obviously, and the trees were rustling, and it just kept screaming like it was being attacked or something. My first thought was that, whoa, that must be a bear or something, but then I realized that bears don't scream like that. So I'm standing there shaking. I can barely stand, in fact, and I decide that I needed to get a weapon quickly out of the shed before I try to go back inside. The house wasn't very close. So I wait until the noise stops, and the second, and I mean the second that I move my leg, I made no noise, mind you, something screams and runs into the woods, just screaming. I could hear it getting farther and farther away because it just kept on screaming. Then the dogs down the road started barking. So I finally got into the shed. I grab a plank of wood, it's all I had, and my phone and my jacket, and slowly start walking back to the house, watching over my shoulder. Nothing else happened that night as far as I could tell, but when my sister opened the door, I was in tears and I was shaking. That night too, I just sat there for hours, pondering what the heck I'd just heard. So, if anybody knows what I should do in order to protect myself, or what it could have been, then please do let me know. Also, if you do think it's just an animal, which it's possible I suppose, then let me know what you think it is and I'll let you know if it sounded like it. Quite honestly though, whatever it was, it sounded huge. And on top of that, I'm really not convinced that it actually was an animal. Many years ago, my nephew and I went for a camping or fishing trip out to Cumberland, Maryland. There's a state campground that is located on Potomac River. The sites are dispersed for the most part, and not many people were there camping. We drove to the end of the campground to the last campsite, far away from the other campers as we could get. We set up camp and everything was normal. It was quiet that day too, with the exception of normal sounds in the forest. Then at around 10 or maybe 11 at night, we heard the sound of a woman singing in the woods. Not a song that you could recognize. It was more of a melody without words, I guess. I heard it, my nephew heard it, and my dog heard it too. My dog was laying down by the fire and jumps up and starts staring into the woods. I look at my nephew and he looks freaked out. I asked him if he heard the woman singing and he says, "I don't hear anything and I'm going to bed," which is total BS because he's about 10 feet away from me and it was pretty loud. It sounded as if it was coming from one direction though, but no direction in particular. I've read about disembodied voices and maybe that's what we heard. It sounded like someone maybe 20 or 30 feet away though. It wasn't scary or ominous, but it was a little bit unsettling. I told my nephew that we should walk around and see what it was, but he just wasn't interested. And after a few minutes, it stopped. I can say for sure that nobody was hiding in those woods too. I've camped with my dogs for years and he was very alert to things moving around in the woods. He would have made it known to someone that they weren't welcome there, and it was strange that he didn't bark or growl. He just sort of stood up and stared into the woods just like I did. I tried to find any info online about similar experiences there, but I didn't come up with anything. It was a strange experience for sure, and it really has me scratching my head. It was evening at my mum's house at around 9 or 10 p.m. I was about to cook something in our dirty kitchen. The kitchen is located at the backmost part of our house. It's at the very corner of our lot in between two rooms, the neighbour's property, and a half-wall opening to an open lot. The wall is about 5 feet with metal bars and chicken wire on top to prevent snakes and rodents going inside of our home. I turned on the lights though and instantly was greeted by this white, bald humanoid. I'll call it humanoid, but it definitely was not human. It had bloody red veins on its head. It had long fingers, or nails, I'm not really sure, that were as long as its head. It was poking out behind the upper left corner of the half wall. I just froze there trying to make out what the heck this was that I was looking at. I think it must have been a good 5 seconds that I was just standing there. Its hand moved in a sort of fanning motion, I guess. A good example of this is when an Oriental person folds a fan or opens and then closes it, in that sort of motion. Its hands were in front of its face doing this, simultaneously going down the half wall, disappearing from view. And when it was gone, boy did I storm out of that kitchen. Now, this year, we were there for the holidays and we were about to leave the house when it happened. My wife said that she had seen a pale white arm from the room adjacent to the dirty kitchen. As she described it, the hand did the same fan-like motion and vanished to the room. My wife said that the arm had a sort of shadow to it, and the arm poked out of the door, and when the arm disappeared, she got closer to take a look, and weirdly, she found that the door to the room was actually closed. So, how was an arm there to begin with? I didn't tell the first story to my mother, but when my wife saw the thing and that it seems like it's already inside this house, we asked her to burn some incense in that part of the house to try to get rid of it. But my questions are, what is this creature? Has anyone had a similar experience? And what did you do to get it to leave your house alone? There are 2 pieces of context that you need to understand for this story, so bear with me. First, I've had severe insomnia since I was a kid, and growing up I was consistently awake until the early morning. And 2, the second floor of my house at the time was one room. My bed was in the corner, separated from the rest of the room by bookshelves and a wardrobe, but they didn't reach the ceiling and there was no door, so I could see and hear anything happening on the second floor. The upstairs room had a door to the outside that was connected to a nearby hill by a poorly constructed bridge made of 3 long unsecured boards. The door had bells tied to it because when I did sleep, I would always sleepwalk. Now, this happened when I was around 11. I lived in a very rural area in the house that I described, and one night when my parents were asleep, sometime in the early AM, I heard an aggressive rattling from the outside door, like really aggressive rattling, and bells ringing. I had no idea how my parents didn't wake up. From the sound of it, it was definitely human, not an animal. I don't think that they were trying to pick the lock or anything. It sounded like they had the doorknob in their hands and they were just shaking the door as hard as they possibly could, trying to brute force it, I guess. Mind you, they're standing on a few wobbling planks of wood around 10 feet off the ground, which was cement, so kicking the door down wasn't exactly a viable option here. They shook the door for several minutes though, then took a pause before trying again. They did this repeatedly. And as soon as I'd begin thinking that they'd left, the rattling would start again. They couldn't get in because the upstairs door was always locked, due to it being unsafe and all, but the downstairs door to the house was always unlocked. We lived a considerable drive from the nearest house and the road was barely usable anyway, so we just didn't think that we needed to lock it, ironically enough. All this person had to do was try the front door. Well, it happened a second time several weeks later, the exact same pattern. Shake the doorknob, stop, shake again. They still didn't try the front door, but after that they never tried it again, as far as I'm aware anyway, despite me going to bed every night expecting them, which is honestly the best ending that one can hope for given the circumstances. Now, I live a 9-hour drive from that house and life has gone on. It does feel kind of weird that I have no idea who did it, and that I could meet them without even realizing. Maybe I already have. But as far as scariest moments of my life go, this definitely makes the top 10. It was that paralyzing fear where you cannot move or scream. I couldn't alert my parents, I couldn't do anything. If they had gotten inside, I probably wouldn't have even run. To this day, I have nightmares where something bad happens and I cannot scream. My parents still think that I'm lying about all of this, and after talking with my brother, I found out that he was woken up that night and heard it too. His bed was closer to the door, so he could probably hear it better than even me. And despite not having many people, the area that I'm from has a very high murder and disappearance rate. There was a murder the year that this happened that took place on the road that I lived on, in fact. And who knows, maybe the guy that they booked for that is my mystery culprit. I still think about this a lot. So about 3 years ago, I was out for a late night walk in the park that was about 2 blocks from where I lived at the time. It was a pretty safe neighborhood, so I often felt comfortable walking around alone during the late hours. I remember it being around 3:30 in the morning. Don't ask why I was up that late or walking around during that time. But let's just say that I was going through some stuff, and in hindsight, I know it really wasn't smart, especially as a young woman. But anyway, I approached the park, which was lined with large bushes. There was also a street next to the park, and on the other side of the street, a large grassy field. Suddenly, I spotted a bald man carrying large objects wrapped in black plastic. He also had on blue surgical gloves and a long plastic jacket. He seemed to be transporting these bagged items across the street from the park and into the field. I stopped and watched for a moment. As he began crossing the street again with more bagged items, he stopped when he saw me and ran towards the bushes. He stuffed the bags into the bushes and hid in them. I could see him clearly, and the whole situation gave me really bad vibes all of a sudden. I quickly turned around and I started walking back home. I glanced back to make sure that he wasn't following me, and I saw his bald head peering over the bushes, staring at me. I started speed walking, and when I was about a block away, I saw him sprint across the street and hide behind a large tree. Again, all I could see was his bald head peering around the side of the tree, staring at me. By this point, my heart was racing, but I kept walking quickly. I didn't want to run because I didn't want him to know that I could see him following me. My thought process was, if a lion is stalking you, it's not a good idea to run, because they'll start chasing you. I just focused on staying calm and getting home safely. Finally, I reached my house and locked both the front and the back doors. I tried to shake off what had just happened and tried to go to sleep. The next day was completely normal. I decided to walk to the park in daylight when there were lots of people around, and I checked the bushes to see if he'd left anything behind, but there was nothing. Later that night, though, I sat down to watch a movie. I decided not to go on any more late-night walks after that incident, at least for a while. Even though nothing really happened to me, it was still pretty creepy, and I realized that it could have turned into a bad situation. I mean, you just never know what someone like that is capable of, right? It definitely seemed like I had caught him doing something suspicious. And well, while I was watching this movie, I got up to grab a glass of water. My kitchen has a window next to the sink with a view of the backyard, and I always kept the kitchen lights off at night so I could keep an eye on the yard without anyone being able to see me. And when I looked out into the backyard, to my surprise, I saw him standing there in the middle of my yard, just staring at my house. I knew that it was him too instantly because even in the dark I could make out his pale bald head. I immediately cracked open the window and yelled, "Hey!" and he took off running, leaving the gate to my fence wide open. Since then, I have not seen the man again. I still have no idea what he was doing there that night, or what his intentions were in following me home and stalking my house like that. But quite honestly, I don't think that I do want to know. So my ancestors came from a very small town, and back then, everyone had outhouses due to no actual plumbing or even underground water lines or anything. I believe that this is still the case too. In other words, it's pretty remote there, and there are other surrounding towns with similar circumstances. There is hardly anything to do other than to hang out with other people there, play some sport, or go up to nearby mountains, etc. But this one evening, we were hanging out with a buddy whose family owned a small store. I cannot even remember all the stuff that we were talking about now, but at some point my cousin started talking about this old man that we all knew. As far as I can remember, he was probably in his late 60s, didn't have any family that I could recall, and he lived alone in his house or property. In my cousin's own words, he used to tell me how he would escape his enemies by disappearing. He said that they would step all over him and that it would hurt, but that he needed to keep quiet so that he wouldn't be discovered. Now, this old man already had a reputation for being a witch of some sort, and that's what some people referred to him as well. I always thought that the locals called him that because he was a bit antisocial, old, and had seemingly no friends as well. But my cousin would talk to him on occasion as he walked through the town. Just a simple, "Hey, mister, and how's it going?" that sort of thing. So my cousin and the other kids from that town, they were talking about him and how mysterious he was, and that they believed that he did indeed practice black magic. So after we were done talking, it was probably around 10 p.m. now. The store had already closed since like 6 p.m. or so, and my buddy wanted to keep it shut so that we could keep talking about whatever without anybody listening. So once we left, this old man's house was about 3 properties away from the store. And while we were still talking about it, he was apparently looking over his abode wall, which was maybe 6 feet tall. And he was not as tall as that, so he may have been standing on a chair or something, but he was leaning over the wall and had the creepiest ear-to-ear smile on his face while kind of nodding his head up and down while watching us walk down the road. This road, like many others, wasn't paved. Again, a very small town with very little 20th century features. And at that point, we were all pretty creeped out by that, and it definitely scared us. Of course, there was no way to tell if he really was a skinwalker or anything, but at that point, I firmly believed that he was something evil, and I wanted nothing to do with him. The reason that we think that he was a skinwalker was that, years later, because it's a small town, like just about every other Mexican small town, there are always certain people that are accused of practicing black magic. Most of the time, these people are accused of being something that is supposed to be witches that transform into owls. So the fact that my cousin said that he could disappear, I figured now that that means that he can transform, and that's why I now believe that he was a skinwalker. In any case, I really have no proof for that, but it was odd that he was listening to us like that, and sort of knew that we were talking about him. Which begs the question, did his black magic powers help him realize that we were talking about him? Because otherwise, what the heck was he doing leaning over the wall with that creepy smile like that? At a time of night when most people were asleep as well? The whole thing was just weird and really ominous. Most times, people refer to skinwalkers as folks in the US, particularly natives. But now that I think about it, skinwalkers have always been prevalent in Mexico, except we don't call them that. However, one can easily see the overlapping culture between Mexico and native Indian tribes for sure. Anyway, like I said, the whole situation was really weird, and obviously a lot of this is speculation, but still, how did he know that we were talking about him? My encounters with this individual, who I'll call Ben, began in November of 2024 in school. He was a friend of one of my friends, Tom, and eventually we became part of the same friend group. I've always found Ben a bit creepy, which seemed to be the school population's general view towards him as well. However, once we began regularly socializing, I began to feel pretty bad for my presumptions. That was, until we were added to a WhatsApp group conversation that was when things started to turn. First, it was the mindless constant images of gore that he would send, involving torture victims and murders, and I don't even know if these images were real, but they made me very uncomfortable, to the point that I asked him to stop, to which I was told to take a joke and stop being such a wuss. This was followed by messages where he stated that he killed a cat, along with some sick fantasies involving people that I knew. I wasn't sure if Ben was just your average edgelord, which was my other friend's attitude, but something just didn't seem right. Then, one Saturday I was alone Christmas shopping in my town when I noticed Ben standing down the road from me, just staring directly at me. I sort of just waved at him awkwardly, to which he just stared before walking casually down a side street for the rest of the trip, and every time I turned, Ben was standing, just staring at me, at a distance. I eventually just gave up shopping and I went home pretty ticked off, and I texted him about it, to which he just stated that he didn't know what I was talking about. Then in school on lunch, Ben and another friend, Jack, convinced me to come with him to the forest behind our school with another friend, Zach. It was stupid, I know, but I was bored and was accompanied. Anyway, we started getting deeper in and Ben was becoming weird. He was laughing and kept repeating, "Closer, closer." Eventually both me and Zach agreed that it was creepy and off-putting, and so we returned. Ben seemed really angry when he and Jack returned. However, when we asked what they wanted us to go further in for, he responded that he wanted to set a fire and show us. Well, after this I distanced myself and I left the group chat, though was eventually re-added. While on my hiatus from that group though, Ben apparently attacked Tom with a homemade blade. I believe it was a razor from a sharpener or something. It was in school and it resulted with a wound near his wrist, which this resulted in Ben being expelled from the school, but no legal action was actually taken. It's now been a month and I was re-added to the group chat to find that Ben has been sending really graphic photos and talking about his hatred for his family, blaming them for his misfortune. And so, I'm genuinely worried that he gives off killer vibes, but perhaps I'm just being paranoid. I often wonder about that time in the forest and also in the town plaza and what the heck he was up to. But anyway, thanks for listening to this, and I'm just wondering if you guys think that I should be concerned or if I'm just overreacting. I also sometimes worry that Ben knows where I live and, well, he really isn't that far away. I was living in Asia at the time when I had a strange and unsettling dream. In it, I was back at my mum's house in England, where my nephew had been staying for the past 2 months after going through a difficult time. My sister was there too, and we'd had an argument. I usually stayed in her room when visiting, but she wouldn't give it up for me that time. So I was left wondering where I could sleep, and my old bedroom was out of the question because I was allergic to something in it or whatever. In the dream, I asked my mum, "Can I stay in my room?" and she responded, "I don't know where your nephew is. He's either asleep or he's dead." It was so unlike her to say something so dark like that. But I woke up suddenly at 2 a.m., heart racing, thinking how strange that was. I then checked my phone and I saw a message from my brother, sent just minutes after I'd woken up, and he told me that my nephew had gone missing again. He'd disappeared before, but always came back. My first thing that I asked was if he had taken his phone charger with him, and when my brother said no, I felt a deep sense of dread. My nephew practically lived on his phone, and it was unusual for him to leave without a charger like that. We launched a social media campaign that went pretty viral, and I had people praying for his safe return. For a few days, I tried to convince myself that it would be like the last time and that he would come back. I attended a church retreat, and during the service, a speaker kept talking about suicide, seemingly directing his gaze at me. Even my friend noticed it too. Still, I didn't connect it to my nephew, and I kept believing everything would be fine. However, something shifted after that night. I returned home and suddenly felt certain that something was wrong. My nephew wasn't someone who could rough it outside like that for days. I texted my sister for updates, feeling uneasy. Moments later, my mum called, asking if I was alone and sitting down. I knew immediately that something was wrong. She told me that they had found my nephew's body washed up on a beach several cities away. He had gone missing at 6:30 in the morning the day that I had that dream, and his body had actually been found the day after he disappeared, but it took some time to identify him. We struggled to get answers and still don't fully know what happened, and at one point I started praying just to get his things back. He had left his bank card, passport and phone behind, and miraculously the very next day, 3 months later, the police called out of the blue and said that they had found his passport and bank card. I prayed again for answers about what had happened and why he had suddenly done this. And the next day I was told that his friends had been meeting up with his mum to share information about what might explain what led to his death. We still didn't know if he fell by accident or intended to jump, but it gave us some additional insight. Another time I prayed for more information, like where he was at the time of his death and what happened in his final moments. The next morning, I woke up feeling an urgency to check an old WhatsApp group. I found one with just me, my mum and my sister, where my nephew was still listed as a member. I asked my sister to go through it to see if she could find any old pictures or messages or anything. And then, at exactly 11:42 a.m., a notification appeared. My nephew's name had left the chat. My sister was shocked, and we checked the group chats, and although there was no notifications, he was no longer listed as a member of any of them. I tried calling his WhatsApp, but it said that the number was no longer registered. We later discovered that WhatsApp automatically deletes accounts after 120 days of inactivity, and when we backtracked the date, we realized that 11:42 a.m. was the exact same time of his last activity on the day that he went missing, which suggested that this was likely the moment that he had made his final decision. Well, it's all still very heartbreaking. Knowing that he probably didn't suffer for long was a small comfort, I guess. I continued having dreams where my nephew would tell me things or even apologize, and it makes you wonder whether there's truly an afterlife or if our minds somehow pick up on information we're not consciously aware of or something. Because what I know now is that he was already dead at the time of that dream. So my brother Brian and I grew up very close. Movie nights with family, family dinners, game nights, holidays, family road trips, very normal stuff. We eventually grew up and now, both in our 20s, moved away from home. I haven't seen him recently, but we text here and there to confirm aliveness. Brian suddenly, though, became extremely religious nearly overnight. I'm talking extremely. Now, I don't judge anyone for anything like this, but no one in our family is particularly religious or anything, and he does not have any religious friends at all either. But apparently he found a church in his new city that he is giving his life to, and he's completely isolated. His only friend is the priest. He is secretive about what church it is, though, and he spends all of his time there as well. Brian is there late at night every day, supposedly helping clean up, but that just doesn't sound right to me. They took a mission trip to Mexico recently, and I can only imagine what in the world went on there. The only media that he consumes is religious now, and he has no friends outside of this church. He only goes to church outside of work, and before ending each conversation, he'll ask, Are you ready to give your life to God or suffer in hell? He recently took a trip back home to visit our family, and my mum says that the whole thing just felt wrong. He sat silent much of the time, observing. Otherwise, he looked far removed, even while looking right at her. His energy filled the room and made her feel very uncomfortable. He was no longer the bubbly and affectionate guy that he always has been. He kept his distance and had nothing to say, really. And when he left, she said that she doesn't expect that he'll be coming back either. Once a month, we catch up by playing video games together, and we'll play for hours. This is our bonding time. I entertain his religious conversations, regardless of my opinion. Our last game night, he had so much fun that he wouldn't let me log off until around 2 a.m. And I recently found out that he gave his console away to a church member. I was pretty upset by that. I felt like he didn't think about what that meant. We are not the phone call types, but we love video games and played growing up together, so game nights were perfect for us. He called me though the other night to address the issue, and he gave it away because his future wife, a premonition, is coming and she wouldn't like him playing with the other girls, and he doesn't have time for anything except the church now. I know that this sounds absolutely too insane to be real, but unfortunately it is. He assured me that he will be completely cutting me off because his premonition wife is more important than his relationship with me. He spoke with such clarity that it was terrifying to be so deluded yet so sure of yourself like this. But what type of church influences you to cut off family and friends like this? He'll be moving overseas to find his premonition wife soon, apparently. I was pretty shocked by that. A premonition? Really? Our dad called him and asked why he needed to cut me off, and you must feel for her another way than for your sister like that. But Brian avoided the question and didn't answer. Yeah, I know. How could it get worse than a premonition wife? But I'm sick for many reasons. Losing sleep. I fear that my brother is in some sort of cult while under religious psychosis or something. On top of ruining our relationship with possible feelings towards me, his sister, and honestly, I'm just a mess of confusion. I mean, what in the hillbilly heck is this, and what's going on? How could it get worse? My mother believes it's an attempt at removing the temptation, aka me, from his life, and I'm stuck between wanting to understand what the heck type of church this is and also agreeing that I don't want anything to do with it. No one knows what to say to me, and honestly, I cannot blame them. And I guess I'm just mourning what once was our relationship, but the situation is giving me chills, and I just don't know where to go from here. All I can think of is this one quote that I read, which reads, "The more devout they are, the uglier their faith will become, since it's based on a lie." I was born in 1999, and around 2008, when I was about 9 years old, I lived with my mum, stepdad, and 2 sisters. An older sister, 2 years older than me, and a younger sister, 4 years younger, on the 3rd floor of an apartment building in the south of France. The apartment wasn't very big and had 2 bedrooms, one at each end of the apartment. We were set up like this. My stepdad, mum, and little sister shared 1 bedroom near the living room, and my older sister and I shared the 2nd bedroom. The apartment was in an old building that had been renovated several times, but still felt pretty ancient. We sometimes heard strange things, I guess you could say. My mum once heard the sound of blankets dragging across the hallway outside of her room, thinking that it was my older sister sleepwalking, which she did occasionally. My mum opened the door, but as soon as she did, the sound stopped. Another time, she and my stepdad were woken up by someone aggressively rattling their bedroom doorknob. They even had an out-of-body experience on occasion. One night, though, in 2008, I was sleeping in my room with my sister when I woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. Slowly, I opened my eyes. Since I was facing the wall, I turned over, and that was when I saw it. There was a figure standing in the middle of the room, a man. He was just standing there, looking into the distance. He was facing my sister's side of the room, but not looking directly at her, and I froze, paralyzed with fear. I kept watching him, but I squinted my eyes, pretending that I was still asleep so he wouldn't notice me. The man wasn't very tall. He looked older, a little bit overweight, with medium-length curly blonde hair, big round glasses, and a brown robe that, as a child, I described as being made of burlap. He wore what I called a painter's hat and held a golden bowl in his right hand with a candle inside of it. But here's the weirdest part. The candle only lit him. The rest of the room stayed pitch black. Even the small star and moon-shaped mirrors that my mum had hung on the wall didn't reflect the candlelight. Weirdly too, he looked lost, like he didn't know where he was and was fumbling around in the dark like that. He took cautious, tiny steps, looking around nervously. My first instinct was to hide under the covers as quietly as I could. Once I was under the blanket, I started telling myself that this whole thing had to be a dream. I remembered seeing cartoon characters pinch themselves to check if they were dreaming, so I started pinching my forearm as hard as I could. Then I slowly peeked out of the blanket, and he was still there. I squeezed my eyes shut as tightly as possible, thinking that if I opened them, he'd be gone, but when I opened them, he was still there. I tried again, squeezing my eyes shut, opening them, and still there. Again and again, I tried this. People have told me that it must have been sleep paralysis, but as far as I know, I've never had it before or since then. Plus, sleep paralysis is called that for a reason. You're supposed to be paralyzed, right? But I definitely wasn't. Well, eventually I hid under the blankets and looked one more time, and he was gone. And after that, I didn't sleep that night. We moved out of the apartment a few years later. The neighbor below us moved into our old place. Her son and I are friends, but we lost contact over the years, so I have no idea if they ever experienced anything similar to what I did that night. So I grew up on a hill a good 300 feet tall, to the east of Silicon Valley. You could see the valley looking west and a large lake looking east, with no roads or anything all the way to Highway 5. A rich dude purchased land for a golf course and a country club or something. This was about a quarter of a mile from my home. It was one of the kinds with a tennis court, golfing, several pools, a hot tub, 5 yurt round type buildings with different functions, weightlifting, aerobics, party spot, etc. Then there was a maybe 10k foot building down a bit further past the last swimming pool, wedding events and whatever, but we at a certain point began calling it Motel Hell. This was when I was around 5 years old, and we went there a fair bit. At some point, the developer decided to abandon it. Pools turned green and then dried up. We were in our early teenage years at this point, running about, toilet papering neighbors, running about in the middle of the night as we thought that we were invincible, shooting flare guns at cops, etc. Doing things that would get you thrown in jail as a terrorist these days. It's pretty sad how that has changed, but anyway, we had seen these ritual drawings and such in various locations around the place at some stage. We learned about some of them from the library, and when we would go into the 10k foot party location, there would be large drawings on the floors, the walls, etc. And we would all notice that even if it was 100 degrees outside, it could be cold almost to seeing your breath in there. We also knew that there were people there at night, because our bus stop was in the parking lot, and we would spend mornings breaking the many hundreds of bottles left sitting around by the older teenagers at night. My friend's house was just over the driving range, and he moved in and could see visible writing on his walls at certain times of the day. It looked like it was invisible ink, creating a ritual space for magic, and not good stuff if you ask me. He had some difficult times there, and I witnessed some really weird stuff there as well. Anyway, one day we're out running around at about 2 in the morning one Friday. We could see lights in the club and decided to sneak up and around through the golf course from the back. There were more bushes and trees there, and we crept up and got into earshot and sight of these people. We saw them performing what looked like a ritual. After a few minutes observing them, one suddenly turned his robes and pointed out into the dark toward us. I'm not sure what he said, but they all instantly sprinted out into the darkness towards us. It wasn't like they could catch us, but they tried for a good hour, I would say, not realizing that we were right next to them under the bushes, up trees, etc., sprinting from hiding spot to hiding spot sporadically as they combed the golf course for us. We hunkered down at one point after they lost us, but after that we left and we promised that we would never go back there again, because whatever they were doing, it really didn't seem good. This took place when I was in the 8th grade. My father was in the military, now retired, and since it was just me and him in the home when he went on deployment, I either had to go and live with my mother or move to Indiana to go and live with my grandparents. I chose my grandparents in the end. So, the first few months living with them were pretty normal. I got closer with my grandma, and she decided to tell me this story about how she used to be a tutor, for English I think, and she taught this little girl who was diagnosed with leukemia at a young age, so the doctor said that she wouldn't make it past the 1st grade. But, through perseverance, she made it halfway through to 3rd grade before she unfortunately passed away. Throughout this time, my grandma was there from kindergarten to 3rd grade, helping her with work, sometimes even visiting her during doctor appointments to cheer her up, and when she passed, she gave my grandma a bracelet of hers to keep. I don't know if you guys believe in the important stuff from someone carrying their spirit with them, but this made me believe it 100%. So during my summertime after 8th grade, I was still in Indiana, and I'd stay up late playing Sea of Thieves with my friends, and I'd get hungry, and so I would sneak to the kitchen and make myself a sandwich or two. But on the way back, I had to go through the single hallway in the house that had the bathroom and the entrances to all 3 bedrooms in the house there. And you know how when you run into someone while walking that you sort of stop and kind of lean back a bit to prevent hitting them? Well, when I started walking down the hallway, I get about halfway through and I felt like I just ran into someone that felt about maybe up to my chest, and I fell to the ground. Not hard, but just enough to make me land on my butt. That's when I look up and I see a little girl in a pink puffy dress, but she's kind of opaque. She emanated this soft light, enough to where I could just see her, and it freaked me the heck out. So I backed up a bit on the floor and bumped my head on a nightstand behind me. I blinked for just a second, and then she was gone. I ran to my room and I locked the door after this. I couldn't really sleep after that as well, so I stayed up just enough until I saw daylight, and then passed out in my bed. I woke back up at around 2 p.m, and the first thing that I did was tell my grandma about it. I described what the girl looked like, and Grandma instantly started crying. She told me that I described the girl that she used to tutor for. I have no idea why she decided to show herself to me, but maybe she wanted to tell me something that I couldn't see. I work for film production, and we were shooting a horror film in an old house one day, built in the 1940s. It had a basement and then 2 floors and a small attic. The master bedroom is on the 2nd floor, and when you go up the stairs, it's like an anteroom filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves of old books surrounding the entire room. It was hauntingly beautiful, and on one wall, between two shelves, is a French door leading to the masters. At the right side of that door is the stairs leading to the attic, and inside the masters is a quiet, roomy bathroom. The master bedroom and the attic have the most bad juju feels in the house, I guess you could say. The basement is okay, and so is the rest of the house. But we spent a total of 10 shoot days there, no sleepovers though. And it was around the 7th or maybe 8th day that we were shooting at the bathroom of the master bedroom. It can only fit one camera on a tripod there and lights and a handful of crew and people, and the 2 actors for the scene, of course. We were ready for the take and everybody was quiet and standing behind the camera. We were just waiting for the director's call for action, and it was taking quite a while when suddenly he angrily announced on the system, "Who is that person in the frame?" Of course, we were all pretty puzzled by this. I mean, the only people in the room were the 2 actors. But apparently in the director's monitor, he was seeing a person wearing black pants and black leather shoes, right beside one of the actors. In the frame or the monitor, the camera wasn't really focused on the side of the additional person, so he was only able to see below the knee down to the shoes. But nobody wears black leather shoes for our line of work. And all of us crew people were behind the camera. We can clearly see that nobody else was there within the frame aside from the 2 actors as well. We moved the camera a bit, checked the lens, put it back in the same place, and then no more extra person. Needless to say, we wrapped up early that night. So I'm female and 20, and I've never really been one to believe in supernatural stuff. But what has happened to me over the past 3 weeks, well, it's changed everything. This story is going to sound a bit insane, but I need to get this off my chest. It all started when I was alone at my aunt's house. Let's call her Aunt A, while she and her husband were on vacation. I was in the bathroom one morning, just about to close the door, when I saw them, my aunt and her husband entering the door. I even feel her hand cold holding the door and touching me. It looked completely real, but here's the thing. They were supposed to be on vacation. I called out, but no one answered, and when I checked the living room, it was empty. I couldn't understand what was happening. Things got even weirder after that, though. My mum, who was also at the house, told me that she saw my niece punch her in the arm, but that kid was with my Auntie A in another continent. My mum was freaked out, and honestly, I was starting to feel like I was losing it. That night, my mother and I woke up with bruises all over our bodies, and I can assure you that they weren't from bumping into anything, but deep, dark bruises, like somebody had grabbed us while we were asleep. On top of that, we both had terrifying nightmares. It felt like we didn't even really sleep, like something was attacking us while we were unconscious. But it didn't stop there. One night after we had left my Aunt A's house, I woke up in my own apartment to the most terrifying thing that I have ever seen. Because there, outside of my window, my dead Aunt B face was staring in. She had passed away though, 16 years ago, and I can assure you that it was her. Her eyes were wide and wild, staring directly at me with a horrible smile, and I couldn't move. I was frozen. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming, but my mother saw it too. We both saw her. But here's the worst part. Even though I moved out of my Aunt A's house, the strange occurrences just didn't stop. In fact, it's only gotten worse. I started hearing things, footsteps when nobody was there, whispers, spirits walking around. But it didn't stop at night. These ghostly figures with deformed faces and weird, unsettling smiles started appearing wherever I was. Sometimes they'd be people that I didn't even recognize. Sometimes they'd be dead family members. I'd see them at work, at the store, even in my car at times. This whole thing got to the point where I actually had an incident at work. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on anything, and I saw two of these things following me. I ran yelling and crying, and I ended up fainting because I fell from the second floor right there in the middle of a shift. I woke up in a psychiatric hospital, confused and scared, not even sure how I got there. My coworker said that I started panicking and yelling that it was something in front of my hospital room trying to kill me, and of course no one saw anything. I've tried everything to make it stop. I've put holy water around my apartment, and I've even called a psychic to help, but nothing works. In my culture, we believe that bad spirits target vulnerable people, and it feels like I'm being followed, like something bad is trying to claim me. The ghostly faces still appear, sometimes with twisted, smiling expressions, and I'm afraid that it's only a matter of time before something worse happens. Which is why I'm here. I really don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality, and I cannot escape these visions. I'm scared to go to sleep, scared to leave my home. My psychiatrist thinks it's trauma and a PTSD response, or worse, schizophrenic disorder, which, of course, I don't have. But has anyone experienced anything like this? And if you did, what the heck did you do about it? If you know anything, then please do tell me, because I need answers. I was living with my mum and little sister, who was 3 at the time. I had lived there for 2 weeks when, one night while in bed, in the middle of the night, I thought my French bulldog jumped onto my bed as I felt the weight of something pretty heavy on my feet. I was on my phone, not paying attention in the pitch black at like 3 a.m., and my dog had a habit of pacing around all the rooms in the house at night. I didn't look as I was so sure that it was her because of the sheer weight of it, and the mattress was dipping too, until I went to try and move my feet as I had pins and needles, and looked up from my phone and saw that the dog was not there. I put the lamp on straight away, thinking that I just couldn't see her because it was too dark, and pulled the covers really hard and ran into the hallway shouting for my dog. She waddled in but didn't want to come in and was being awkward, which scared me even more as she was obedient for the most part. To my actual horror as well, I turned to get back into bed, and there was a huge dip on the end of my mattress that I saw slowly imprint into the shape of somebody's leg and buttocks, and I was so scared that I held my breath. My dog was staring at the bed from the hallway and started growling, which again just really is not like her. I was about to risk it all and shout for my mum, even though I knew that she would be annoyed if I woke her up, when I saw the mattress lift up and the dog stopped growling. I stayed up all night that night as I was too scared, and my dog stayed with me, and I shut the door so that she couldn't roam the house any longer. 2 days later, though, I'm in the bath with soap in my eyes when I feel a tapping on my shoulder. I assume it was my little sister wandering, who was non-verbal at the time. I tried to say to her to go to Mum, as she shouldn't be walking in on people without knocking, etc. Then I started shivering and I went really cold all of a sudden. I wipe my eyes to turn to speak to her, and when I do, there's no one there. I shouted for my mum, where is my sister, and she said that she was playing in the garden on her bike. Well, I got out very quickly and tried to avoid thinking about it too much. Then, that night, something truly awful happened. I went to bed, fell asleep earlier than usual, and then woke up from a terrible nightmare. I couldn't remember what it was, but I was sweating profusely. I smoked at the time as well and went downstairs, which I never did, as I was pretty scared of being near the back door at night. It was around 2 in the morning, and when I was standing there, I heard a massive smash sound sound, like glass breaking and falling into the garden. I found out the next day that the neighbor had actually gone through her windows, even though she was very quiet and didn't have any issues with anybody. I was pretty terrified, so I went to the front door instead, as I was unsure if I was losing my mind at this point. I finish, and as I'm walking up the stairs, I hear a massive smash in my bedroom. I go to my room, and the massive glass picture has come off the wall. It was secured with screws though, and so that didn't make any sense, and smashed right where my head would have been,